A Very Merry Christmas. A Dash of Darcy and Companions Collection, Book 3, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorised voice replica. Chapter 1. Mary Bennet stood behind her elder sisters, waiting to exit their pew. Her father had already made his escape, but her mother was busy making sure everyone knew that Jane and Elizabeth were soon to be married. Mary watched little flecks of dust dance in the beams of light that streamed through the windows as she listened to her mother. How empty her home would be! How fortunate she was to have daughters so well attached! Mary resisted the urge to roll her eyes and silently tapped an impatient toe inside her boot. Finally, when all the neighbour ladies had heard of her good fortune, Mrs. Bennet moved far enough into the aisle to allow Mary and her sisters to be liberated from their box. Unfortunately, they were not free to leave their mother's side as she shooed them behind her. "Oh, Mr. Hammond!" Mrs. Bennet's voice rang out through the nave, catching the fine-looking young gentleman before he could escape his pew. Mary cringed. Must her mother now inform all the gentlemen as well as the ladies? She heaved a resigned sigh as Mr. Hammond turned toward them. Mr. Hammond, you see, was unmarried, and he did not have a sister who would share the joyful news of an upcoming wedding with him. So, Mary realised that her mother no doubt thought it her particular duty to tell him. Of course, this was not entirely without benefit, since her mother's need for attention would give Mary a moment or two to admire him, and for that she could perhaps be grateful. "Have you heard the news?" Mrs. Bennet continued, even before they had reached the place where Mr. Hammond stood. "My 2 eldest daughters are to be married. The announcement was made at Mr. Bingley's ball, but I do not recall seeing you there." There was a bit of a teasing scold in her tone. Mr. Nicholas Hammond stretched his lips into a thin smile. Mrs. Bennet had probably wished for him to dance with her daughters. She was always putting forward one or another of them. I was not in attendance, as there were things which required my attention on my estate. A rather lengthy bill of sale had arrived earlier that day from his father, and Nicholas had been more eager to see his finances settled than he was to dance away the night in a set of clothes that, if his father continued his ways, Nicholas would not be able to afford if he was to keep to his own plans. Oh yes, running an estate is such dreadfully taxing work, I am sure. Mr. Hammond struggled to keep the smile on his face. Mrs. Bennet's voice was grating and her tone was patronising. There were no banns read, she continued in her same annoying volume of speaking, somewhere between an exclamation and a screech if you asked Nicholas. They are to be married by special licence. That is why Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley are gone to town, you see, to get the licence. It is a very proper thing, too, considering their consequence. Nicholas nodded and attempted to step away, but she stepped forward for every step he took backward. He had little interest in which daughter was marrying which gentleman, or when the gentlemen were to be returning, or any of the particulars about the double wedding and the breakfast. No, he stopped his failing retreat. That was not entirely true. They will be returning within the week? He was nearly certain that was what Mrs. Bennet had said, and he was pleased when she acknowledged it to be true. There is a small estate matter I wish to discuss with Mr. Bingley. Typically, he would not have explained such a query, but he knew Mrs. Bennet. She was not unlike a dog intent upon winning a bone, and would not cease her inquiries until she had every morsel of information she wanted. So it was best if he provided that morsel himself, rather than leaving it to the imagination of Mrs. Bennet and her friends. He just needed to make sure he told her only as much as he wished broadcast throughout Meryton. "My Kitty is in good looks today, is she not?" Ah, there it was. Miss Kitty was to be the one to be promoted now that her eldest sisters were engaged. The cheeks of the pretty young lady, who stood beside her mother, flushed, and she coughed nervously as her mother prodded her forward, while her younger sister did a poor job of catching a giggle behind her hand. I had not noticed. Nicholas replied to quell the mother's advances, and then, to spare at least some of Miss Kitty's feelings, added, "Although I would have to agree now that you have mentioned it." He looked at the rest of the Bennet daughters, who stood behind their mother wearing varying expressions of unease. And who could blame them? They were sensible ladies, unlike their mother and younger sisters. "I believe all of the Bennet ladies are looking fine today." Nicholas's eyes rested for a moment on Miss Mary. Why was she not the one being thrown forward? She was the next eldest and nearly as pretty as the others. In fact, if he were to be truthful with himself, she was the one he preferred. With this slightly troubling thought in mind, he turned to go, but remembering the beginning of Mrs. Bennet's comments and why any of the younger Bennet girls were being promoted, he turned back and offered his congratulations to Miss Bennet and Miss Elizabeth. Then, with a shallow bow, he took his leave. However, he was only a few steps from the group when Mrs. Bennet's shrill call to Mrs. Long caused him to flinch and falter in his steps. "I must speak to Mrs. Long about the wedding breakfast preparations." He could hear the excitement in Mrs. Bennet's voice. "Jane, Lizzie, you will attend me. Mary, go tell your father that I'll be just a few more minutes." There was no mistaking the commanding tone of the directions, and Nicholas was just beginning to chuckle to himself about how wise Mr. Bennet had been to slip out so quickly at the end of the service, when Mrs. Bennet's next comments drove any merriment from his mind. "I'm afraid it is what she was born for." There was a clucking from someone else. Nicholas assumed without looking back that it was Mrs. Long. His feet seemed rooted to the floor, held in place by the shockingly crass comments of Miss Mary's mother. "Mamma!" That was probably Miss Bennet, he thought. Her voice was gentler than Miss Elizabeth's. "She lost her chance when she did not go to town," Mrs. Bennet continued. "Mr. Collins is all but married now." Ah, yes, Nicholas had heard the Bennet heir was to marry elsewhere, and Mrs. Bennet was none too pleased. There was very little hope of being ignorant of your neighbour's business in Meryton, unless you stayed to your house and never ventured out. Even then, the tales might be brought to you by a servant, who had heard it from a stable boy, who had heard it from the butcher, who had indubitably heard it from Mrs. Bennet, Mrs. Long, or one of their friends. There was more clucking and a sigh from Mrs. Long. Now she will be nothing more than a companion or governess. It is best if she begins acting the part. There was a sad agreement from Mrs. Long and a bit more chiding from one or both of the elder daughters, but Nicholas did not bother to listen. His feet had once again fallen under his command, and he took 2 long strides toward the door. "Miss Mary," he called. Mary stopped her hurried escape from the church. Nicholas could see the embarrassment she felt clearly painted on her cheeks as she turned toward him. It was a feeling with which Nicholas was familiar. His father was no saint. "Mr. Hammond," Mary greeted, keeping her eyes lowered. "Do you know on which day, in particular, Mr. Bingley might return?" It was not actually information that he truly needed to know, but it would suffice as an excuse to keep the biddies and their wagging tongues at bay. It would not be the first time that he and Miss Mary had conducted a conversation. They were friends and had on occasion conversed on the street, in meeting or most often at an assembly, when both he and she had chosen to sit out rather than dance. It was not that he did not like dancing, he did to a point. Nor was it because Miss Mary lacked ability at dancing, she did not. It was the lack of meaningful conversation to be had during a dance that he found annoying. Small talk, the weather, and news of his neighbours were not subjects that interested either him or Miss Mary, and to be honest, this was what he enjoyed most about Miss Mary Bennet, her ability to converse on topics considered non-traditional for a young lady. He glanced over his shoulder surreptitiously. Seeing that he'd caught her mother's attention, he extended an arm to Mary. If her mother wished to promote a lady of quality to any gentleman, and himself in particular, she should be pushing Miss Mary forward. Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia, though quite pretty, were still too young and foolish to be considered as wives. His arm hung in the air between them while Mary looked at it in confusion. Surely she knew what he was asking without him saying it, did she not? "Your mother," he said softly. Mary's eyes widened slightly, and she nodded her understanding before placing her hand lightly on his arm. "I am not her favourite," she replied, in a tone equally as soft as his had been. "This may actually lower me in her eyes, since she will consider it snatching your attention away from Kitty, but I thank you for the attempt." Silently he cursed himself for not considering that. "My apologies," he whispered. She shook her head and replied quietly, "It is not your fault she is as she is." Then, raising the volume of her voice, she answered his original question. "According to Jane, Mr. Bingley hopes to return to Netherfield by Thursday." She tipped her head and looked up at him. Oh, she did love the auburn tinge to his hair. She flicked her eyes away as his green ones turned towards her. "Are you still thinking of leasing a field?" "I am." Apparently she remembered their conversation from the last time they had met on the street in Meryton. She had been fetching something for her mother. How he wished that he could remember what it was. And he had been intent on seeing if Mr. Wilton had a particular book in his shop. Rosemore has done exceptionally well this year, he continued, and with a bit of the profit, I would like to attempt to increase my holdings and my income. It seems a reasonable plan, she said. But then, when was Nicholas Hammond unreasonable? In her opinion, he was the most level-headed, business-minded man in all of Hertfordshire. My father's bills have not decreased, he explained. Again, he knew there was no need to explain himself, but with Mary he felt at ease and knew he would have an ally, and there was also the hope that she might be of use to him in explaining his need for the land to her soon-to-be brother. "Is your mother well?" It was a very proper question, but it was more than just a pleasantry, for there was a tone of sincere compassion in her voice. He smiled. It was just like Mary. Proper, yet not indifferent. "She is. It was merely a trifling cough which only kept her from society for a se'nnight, and according to her most recent letter, now that she's fully recovered, it is a rare afternoon or evening that is not filled with some sort of entertainment and friends. In fact, her schedule was so busy last month that it required a new hat to be purchased since hers had all been worn so many times." He loved his mother, and knew that she was not frivolous or extravagant like his father was. In truth, Nicholas suspected that it was not his mother who required the hat at all, but rather his father who required it of her. He knew his father had an image he wished to portray, and she, being his wife, must assist him. As if she knew what he was thinking, Mary smiled sadly at him as she inquired after his brother, his thoughtless, devil-may-care younger brother, Alfred. "Fred has not been sent down, nor have I received any particularly concerning letters, and since the term will be ending soon, I think he will survive it." They stood outside the church just slightly apart from the other parishioners who, since the day was bright and warm for early December, had remained to converse rather than scurrying away. Mary withdrew her hand from Nicholas's arm and fidgeted with her gloves, making sure they were firmly on each finger. "Will your brother be returning to Rosemore for his holidays?" she asked. Mr. Hammond sighed and shook his head. "I expect more bills from Bath in the new year. Hertfordshire is too dull for Fred's liking, so he has elected to spend his break with our parents." "You will not join them in Bath?" There again was a note of concern in her inquiry. She was not ferreting out information. Nicholas knew her well enough to know that Miss Mary did not tell tales or speak anything less than the truth. He would not be going to Bath. He could not find it in his heart, even for his mother's sake, to spend the money on such a trip, knowing it would be a venture in futility and frustration. He did not say this, however. He just simply shook his head. Mary understood and did not question further. Sometimes, no matter how much you might wish to love your relations, they made it difficult. "I wish I could go to Bath." Mary had risen on her toes and was looking, he suspected, for her father. "I beg your pardon?" he said, somewhat surprised by her comment. Mary had never struck him as someone who might wish to travel away from the small village of Meryton. She seemed so at ease here. She walked to town regularly and rambled through the fields as if they were made just for her presence. Her cheeks, which had just recovered from her previous embarrassment, flushed once again. She had not intended to say that out loud. Not Bath in particular, just somewhere other than here. Ah! He understood the comment now. He had felt the same way when he was younger. School had been his escape. "Is it because of your mother?" he asked gently. Mary nodded as her heart raced. Except for Jane and Elizabeth, she did not speak of her unhappiness to others, especially if that other was a gentleman, whom she wished to notice her for reasons other than her lack of acceptance by her own family. "And my sisters. Oh, not Jane and Lizzie. Kitty and Lydia, and actually not Kitty, she can be quite nice. But Lydia." Her voice trailed off as she realised she was babbling. "Oh, there is my father. I must give him my message, or—" Mr. Hammond held up a hand to stop her and waved her on her way, earning him a grateful smile before she hurried off toward her father. Glancing back over her shoulder to take one more look at Mr. Hammond, Mary saw that he was still watching her. If only he were watching her for the reason she wished he would, but he was not. To him, she was a friend, and he was merely concerned for her welfare. She sighed. If only he would see her as more. But she was plain and read too much and had little to entice a gentleman. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. She may have very well lost her chance of having a family of her own by not walking to Meryton last week and pursuing Mr. Collins as her mother suggested. She shuddered at the thought. No, if that were her only hope for marriage, she would gladly accept spinsterhood. "Papa," she said, tapping his elbow, Mamma is speaking with Mrs. Long and will be a few minutes longer." Mr. Bennet smiled at her and then placed an arm around her shoulder. "You're a good girl, Mary." "Thank you, Papa." He squeezed her shoulder and then removed his arm. "Are you going to wait with me?" "I would like to walk home." She bit her lip and twisted her fingers together as she waited for his permission. His smile was understanding. Is she still upset about Collins? Mary smiled at the way her father's lips curled in disgust as he said the name. "She is, and I should like a few moments of solitude." He chuckled. "It seems your mother has that effect on many, myself included," he added with a wink. "Go on. We will follow shortly and I will try to work on her again." "Thank you, Papa." Mary knew that her father would do as he said, but it would be of little use. Her mother, once set on a notion, was rather immovable. She swung her reticule at her side, letting it brush against the fabric of her pelisse and bang lightly off her leg as she walked. Thoughts of her mother and her future tumbled over each other in her mind. Having reached the spot in the road where she could first see Longbourn, she stopped and considered it for several minutes. The gardens and fields that surrounded the large house with its welcoming drive, the stables and outbuildings, the stand of trees under which she had found refuge on particularly warm summer days. She shook her head slowly as a realization washed over her. She could not stay here. It had never been a terrible home. It had provided her with plenty of enjoyment and pleasant memories. But what would it hold now? A father who found her eccentricities amusing, a mother who would continually remind her that she would never be a wife or mother, and younger sisters who would inevitably parrot everything that their mother said, while her elder sisters, who attempted to protect her, would be gone. Although the sun still shone, the brightness of the day faded, and she wrapped her arms around her middle. It was a bleak reality, and it was hers. She trudged on toward home. Her feet were as heavy as her heart. Perhaps if she was destined to be a spinster, she should take up the mantle now. Aunt Gardner might know of some employment to be had in town, or Lizzie might allow her to come for a period of time to Pemberley. Perhaps in Derbyshire there might be a gentleman as eager to marry as Mr. Collins, who would not be so unbearable, although she was certain. None would be so perfect as Mr. Hammond. Chapter 2. Mary's knock on her father's study door was hesitant. She hoped he would post her letter for her, but she was afraid that after he read it he might not. But worse than that was the thought that he might call her mother in, and things, which had been nearly unbearable for the last week and some days, would become worse. Mary did not wish to leave Longbourn in a state of uproar. She rather hoped that she might quietly slip away after Christmas for a visit with her aunt and uncle without her mother or sisters being any the wiser as to her real plans. "Come," her father called. Mary straightened her dress and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Then, with a calm reassurance to herself that this was the best course of action, she entered the room. "What can I do for you today, Mary?" Her father peeked up from his book, looking over his spectacles and smiling at her. "I have a letter I would like to send to Aunt Gardner." Mary hurried across the room to stand in front of his desk. Her father placed a marker in his book, laid it aside, and held out his hand for the letter. "May I?" His left eyebrow rose as he asked the question while opening the folded page. Mary nodded her consent. She had known he would check it. He often did. She held her breath as he read. Hopefully he would be understanding and not angry. His eyes grew wide. He looked up at her and then back at the letter. Quickly Mary began her practice speech. "It is only what I am destined to be. I have no prospects of marriage at present, and with Mamma's continued disparagements, I shall never have even one while I remain here. I know how to stitch and read, and my playing, although not appreciated by all, is not entirely reprehensible. I think I could make someone a good companion, a young lady in need of instruction or a widow in need of company." "You do not know what you ask," her father murmured, folding the letter and placing it on his desk. "Once a companion, never a bride." Mary swallowed the emotion that rose in her throat at the thought. She knew the risk that taking a position in service posed. Her prospects, which were not many now, would be diminished, and should she be fortunate enough to find a man willing to marry her, he would likely be a tradesman and not of great standing. However, that risk paled in comparison to staying with her mother and then being forced into such service later in life, when all her limited looks had faded, taking any small hope of marriage she might have with them. A companion? Startled by the question, Mary looked behind her. She had been so focused on remembering her speech that she had forgotten to check the room for other occupants. "I cannot stay here," she said to Elizabeth, who came to join her at her father's desk. "You have 2 sisters who are about to marry men of wealth and standing. We could give you a refuge and an opportunity to meet gentlemen outside of Hertfordshire." Elizabeth took Mary's hand. "I had intended to ask Mr. Darcy if I might invite you to live with us." "Has your mother been so cruel as to drive you from my home?" asked her father. Mary bowed her head and was about to admit that her mother had indeed been so cruel when Elizabeth took up the cause. Mamma all but announced to the population of Meryton that Mary had lost her last chance for a husband when she did not pursue Mr. Collins, for telling such a thing to Mrs. Long is the surest way of informing all of the village. "She said this?" Mary nodded, the embarrassment of the words striking her anew. "Where?" her father asked. "Yesterday in church," replied Elizabeth, "after she told Mr. Hammond of Jane's and my betrothals and attempted to put Kitty forward." "In church?" Mr. Bennet's shock was evident in both his features and his tone. "My wife is matchmaking in church." "She is," said Mary, and not discreetly. "I believe," continued Elizabeth, "from the displeased look on Mr. Hammond's face he did not appreciate our mother's attempt." Mr. Bennet shook his head and expelled a frustrated breath. "I have told her time and time again that gentlemen do not like to have ladies thrust upon them." He drew and released one more great breath. "I must attempt to speak to her again." "No, please, Papa," begged Mary. "Allow me to inquire of Aunt Gardner about positions and Lizzie to ask Mr. Darcy if I might live with them. If you speak to Mamma, it will not matter how you came upon the knowledge. She will blame me." Mary glanced at Elizabeth with a sad smile. "She's too pleased with the prospect of a double wedding breakfast to plan, to blame Lizzie, and none of our other sisters draw her displeasure as we do." Mr. Bennet picked up the letter and handed it back to Mary, but did not release it when she accepted it. "I will send this for you once you have added the bit about Mr. Darcy." He removed his hand from the letter. "And I will not say a word to your mother unless I see or hear something with my own eyes and ears, so that she will know it is I, and I only, who deserves her displeasure." He stood and came around his desk. Taking Mary by the shoulders, he looked her directly in the eyes, his own filled with sorrow. "I am sorry, my daughter." He drew her into a brief embrace and then placed a kiss on her cheek. "I will make an effort to be outside of my room more often. It may help." Mary thanked him, as she blinked against the tears that threatened. It was the most compassion and understanding she had ever felt from her father. She tucked the letter back into her pocket and took the back stairs to her room, so that she could add the required information and have this one little security sent away as quickly as possible. Nicholas Hammond groaned and rose from his chair. "Why are you here?" "Good day to you too, brother." Alfred Hammond flopped into a chair. "You remember Whit? Mr. Whitmore?" Nicholas greeted the young man, who had accompanied Fred into the study. At least Ethan Whitmore had the good sense to look uneasy. Nicholas came around his desk and propped himself on the edge of it, intentionally kicking his brother's foot while crossing his ankles. "I might ask the same of you, Whitmore. Are you not both supposed to be in school for at least another week?" "Old man Frohock cannot abide a bit of fun," said Fred, "and wishes not to see me again until after the new year." Nicholas motioned for Whit to take a seat. "I assume you were part of this fun?" "I was, sir." If Nicholas did not know the sort of young man Whit was, such a concise answer, given in such a humble tone, might have convinced him that Whit was an innocent caught up in a scheme not of his doing. But Nicholas knew Whit. Whit was the brains of the pair seated before Nicholas's desk. The idea for a scheme might originate with Fred, but the planning and execution lay firmly at Whit's feet. Nicholas stared first at Whit and then his brother. He would not ask what the trouble had been. He would allow them to volunteer the rope with which to hang them. They would, or Fred would. He affixed his glare on his brother. The clock ticked, counting out the time as the room sat silent. Finally, Fred looked away from his brother. "It was just a bit of fun. I thought my curricle would be faster than Alston's." He smiled widely. And it was. Nicholas nodded but remained silent, his eyes still boring into his brother. "Alston might have scared a young lad and upset a pail of milk." Fred shrugged. "Milk destined, no doubt, for Mr. Frohock's kitchen?" asked Nicholas. Fred nodded. "And you were told to rusticate in the country until the new year because of Alston?" Nicholas's brows rose in disbelief. Mr. Frohock did not take kindly to tomfoolery, but he also did not punish without cause. Fred shrugged again and found a thread on his coat sleeve to be of particular interest as he continued. Alston may have swerved because a curricle came too close to his. A curricle? How many curricles were involved in this bit of fun? 2, said Whit. Just 2, sir. Nicholas nodded. Did your curricle hit his? Fred never told the full extent of his involvement. It was always underplayed. A slight tap, Fred admitted. It will be repaired before I return to school, and Whit has been kind enough to offer his assistance and his vehicle until it is. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and, reaching past his brother's legs, placed it on the desk. I will need that covered before it is released. Nicholas drew a steadying breath. And from where do you expect that money to appear? Fred shrugged and waved at the books on the desk. One of those, I suppose. They're stretched to the breaking point between you and father. I cannot make money for foolish expenses just appear. I can, if you give me some blunt, Fred replied with a smile. No. Nicholas wished to snatch Fred out of his seat and give him a good shake. If you want to waste your allowance on gambling, that is your choice. But I will not be giving you a farthing more until next month. Is that understood? He looked first at his brother and then skewered Whit with a look just to make sure both knew his displeasure. And why are you at Rosemore instead of at your father's estate? He prefers the land to the sea, offered Fred with a smirk at his friend. So, now that Fred felt scolded and unhappy, it was time to offer up his friend. Nicholas wondered how his brother kept any friends. My father has threatened to see me join the Navy if I got into another scrape. Nicholas tipped his head to the side and raised a brow. Then I suggest you begin practicing your sea shanties. Hammond, Fred snapped. Nicholas smiled. Apparently he had finally made the youngster angry. Fred only called him Hammond when greatly put out. Actions have consequences, he said, before picking up the bill which lay on his desk. You may decide if you wish me to pay this and claim your curricle as my own, or if you would rather find a way to pay it yourself. He opened the paper. A little tap. How much damage did you do? He shook his head. No, do not tell me. Just get out of my study and see yourselves to a room. The 2 young gentlemen hurried toward the door. Wait, Nicholas called. How long will you be here? Father expects me in Bath 2 days before Christmas. Nicholas waved him away. Less than 3 weeks. Perhaps he could tolerate his brother for that long a period of time, although he doubted it. If his brother could just rusticate quietly as a proper gentleman did, a bit of hunting, a bit of riding, some reading, and perhaps an evening around a card table. But to Fred, such activities were dull. Fred liked to spend nearly the entirety of his existence carousing. Nicholas dropped his head into his hands. How was he going to tolerate nearly 3 weeks of his brother? How many of his neighbours would be coming after Christmas to collect on some debt? 3 weeks? Perhaps he could survive it. He groaned. No, he was certain he could not. Chapter 3. We will walk with you. Jane fastened her pelisse as she came down the stairs and hurried toward Mary. I've had enough of sitting in the drawing-room listening to Mamma repeat herself. Not one detail shall be missed, since even Papa knows the receipts to be used, Elizabeth giggled. He has looked so pained to have heard about the preparations so many times. Jane poked her head into the drawing-room. Lizzie and I will go with Mary. We can stop at Mrs. Cullip's about our gowns and buy some more trim for the baby bonnets to be included in our baskets to the tenants. The very day after Mr. Bingley's ball, Mrs. Bennet had commissioned dresses for both Jane and Elizabeth. Between wedding garments, gifts for family, and the last few items to be placed in baskets, there simply was not enough time to construct the number of items Mrs. Bennet deemed necessary without employing Mrs. Cullip's services. Even Mr. Bennet had agreed it was an excellent idea, although he, like everyone else in the household, had tired of hearing the anxious comments regarding whether the gowns would be ready on time. 3 weeks! It was not enough time. 6 weeks would have been better. After the new year was soon enough to marry. Mrs. Bennet did not understand the rush. This series of exclamations would be followed by fanning herself and an ample amount of clucking, and at least a half-dozen oh my's. In fact, Mary could hear the clucking of her mother's tongue now as she and her sisters reached Longbourn's front door. Elizabeth linked arms with Mary and, leaning close, whispered just loudly enough for her sisters and Mr. Hill to hear, "With her nerves in such a state, Mamma may expire before Papa, and then any of us marrying Collins would have been a waste." "It is a brisk one today," Mr. Hill said with a smile, that Mary was certain covered a chuckle at Elizabeth's comments. He pulled the door open. "You will return before the sun drops, will you not?" "We will," Jane assured him. Stepping outside, she sighed with pleasure, pulled in a deep breath, and released it. Even cold toes will not diminish the enjoyment of walking to town and not hearing our mother for the entire time. She bit her lip and looked sheepishly at her sisters. "I know I should not say such. It is very unkind, I'm sure. However, as the prospect of having my own home looms, I find it difficult to stay content here." Elizabeth chuckled. "You will still have noise at Netherfield unless Miss Bingley lives elsewhere." "Perhaps she will marry," said Mary. "There must be some gentleman who would wish for her money." There was, in Mary's opinion, very little else that Caroline Bingley possessed that was of value. Miss Bingley was pretty enough as long as one did not attempt a conversation, for when she opened her mouth and began spewing her vitriol about how things were not done as they should be, her beauty faded. Perhaps, in London, Miss Bingley would have better things about which to speak. Perhaps it was just being discontent in Hertfordshire that made her so disagreeable. "One can hope," said Jane. "Miss Bingley did attempt to look happy for me at the ball, but she could not hear of Mr. Darcy's engagement without a decided look of contempt. I fear I shall have to feel, if not hear, her displeasure, since my sister had the audacity to crush any hope Miss Bingley had of becoming mistress of Pemberley." "I am sorry," said Elizabeth. The smile on Elizabeth's face let both Jane and Mary know that she was not sorry in the least. While Jane and Elizabeth continued speculating about their new lives for some distance, Mary was happy to listen, but her heart was not above envying her sisters their good fortune, and as a result a small amount of melancholy crept in. "But," said Elizabeth, after voicing some concern over being so far removed from Jane, "I may have Mary to keep me company. That is, unless we can see her settled in her own home." "Do you wish it?" asked Jane. "To have my own home? Yes, very much. I should enjoy the duties greatly," replied Mary, "but I fear it may never be." "Oh," said Jane, dropping Elizabeth's arm and coming around to take Mary's free arm. "Why ever not? There must be a man of good standing who would wish for a wife so capable as you." "Men wish for pretty wives," said Mary. Jane blinked. "You are pretty." Mary lifted her shoulders in as much of a shrug as a lady could when both her arms are being held by her sisters. "To you, perhaps, but you're so good, Jane. You see only the best." "Jane is right," said Elizabeth. "None of us is so beautiful as Jane, but none of us is so lacking in good looks as poor freckled Mary King." "Lizzie!" cried Jane. "Freckled she may be, but she is not poor," said Mary. "She will have £10,000 upon her grandfather's demise." "She most certainly is poor," insisted Elizabeth. "She is marrying Mr. Collins. Not even £20,000 could make that any more bearable. He is so very odious and dull." Jane and Mary allowed that to be true, and they spent a few moments voicing their pity of Miss King before Elizabeth returned to the subject of Mary's future. "If I am to help you find a husband, you must give me some information about the type of man you would prefer." "I am not ordering a dress," said Mary. Jane laughed. "No, a dress is not so important as a husband, for if you do not like the gown, you can give it away or toss it in the fire. You cannot do that with a husband." Mary laughed but refused to answer, so Elizabeth answered in her stead. "If I remember correctly, you wish for a man of means, but his wealth does not have to be great. He must, however, enjoy discussing serious topics, at least beyond the weather. He must respect you for your intelligence and allow you to question things." Elizabeth squeezed Mary's arm. "Is that about right?" "Oh, wait, he must not be a clergyman." Mary nodded mutely, dumbfounded that Elizabeth had remembered what was said as they sat in the drawing-room the night of the ball. "And," Elizabeth lowered her voice to a loud whisper, "there was someone of whom you were thinking. You must tell us who he is." Mary shook her head. "Then I must guess," taunted Elizabeth. "Lizzie, if she does not wish to tell us, she does not have to," scolded Jane before adding, "although it would make our job of finding someone similar much easier if we knew." Mary shook her head. "I do not wish to endanger a friendship by being thrown into his path." "We are not mamma," said Elizabeth, before leaning around Mary to say to Jane, "He is a friend. Who might be a friend of Mary's who is also a gentleman?" Jane's eyes grew wide, and a smile curled her lips. "Oh, I do not need to guess. I believe I already know." Panic gripped Mary's heart. No one knew of her admiration of Mr. Hammond. She had never mentioned a word of it to anyone, nor had she ever acted fluttery around him, even if her heart always did. "Oh, please do tell," Elizabeth's voice was rife with excitement. Jane shook her head. "If Mary will not name him, then neither will I." Mary breathed a sigh of relief, but her respite was to be short-lived. Jane was not often the mischievous sort. However, it seemed much had changed since she had become betrothed, for with only a hint of a smile and in her sweetest voice, she added, "I must say, however, that I thought him very solicitous to you on Sunday when our mother was behaving so poorly." "Mr. Hammond?" Elizabeth gasped. Mary's cheeks no longer felt the crispness of the December air, but flushed warmly. "You mustn't say or do anything," she demanded. "I do not wish to be forced on any man." She stopped walking and pulled free of her sister's arms. "Promise me." Jane looked contrite for a moment. "I can only promise, Mary, that you will not be forced on any man. I am not my mother." The slight smile from before returned to her lips. "However, I am not above arranging for a meeting where both you and he might be in attendance." Mary narrowed her eyes. "I will go no further than seeing you in the same room," Jane assured her. "Nor will I," said Elizabeth. "Although having been forced on a man by Providence, I can say it is not so terrible a thing." Mary folded her arms, looking first at Jane and then Elizabeth. "If Providence so wishes to force me on a man who already loves me as Mr. Darcy did Lizzie, then he may do so." She held up a finger as both sisters smiled. "But neither of you is Providence." Jane sighed. "No, we are not, but we can ask him to intercede, can we not?" Mary rolled her eyes and sighed. It was probably the best for which she could hope. "If you wish to pray for me to fall into a compromise, you may. An innocent compromise, that is," she added quickly. Elizabeth laughed. "Very well. We shall not pray for you to be seduced." "You may wish to pray the same for Lydia," Mary added dryly before continuing on ahead of them. Mary left Jane and Elizabeth at Mrs. Cullip's door and hurried on to order the things Mamma needed. She checked the list as she walked. Reaching the place where she needed to cross the road, she peeked up to make certain her way was clear before stepping into the street to cross over. She was only 2 or 3 steps into the road when a curricle, driving at a rather fast speed, rounded the corner and began to descend upon her. Gathering her skirts, Mary raced across the road and had barely gained her footing on the walkway when the carriage passed. She stood watching after the curricle, feeling slightly shaken by the ordeal. "Who would drive such a fine vehicle at such a speed through town?" Mr. Wickham inquired from behind her. "I do not know," she replied as she turned to greet him. He offered her an arm. "Allow me to see you safely to your destination." "I thank you, but I believe I can manage on my own." Mary had no desire to be seen walking the streets with a gentleman unaccompanied by her sisters, especially not this particular gentleman. "In fact, propriety says I should not accept your kind offer. Tongues may wag." She tipped her head and gave him a serious look. "I'm convinced neither of us would wish for that." It was not a question. It was a reminder that she hoped he would take. He shrugged and affected a casual pose, resting his weight on his left leg and folding his arms. "I cannot see how my escorting you from shop to shop would cause such a stir." Mary scowled. "I had taken you for a more intelligent sort of fellow." She turned her eyes to her list. "Now, if you would kindly step aside and allow me to get on with what needs doing." She looked back up at him, but he remained infuriatingly nonchalant and in her path. "Oh, very well. If you're so inclined to continue feigning ignorance, allow me to explain. My sisters are not with me. I left them at Mrs. Cullip's. If I'm seen walking arm in arm with you, unaccompanied," her brow rose to punctuate the word, "it will appear as if there is some understanding between us, which there is not." She silently tapped a toe inside her boot in impatience. The day was not growing any younger, and she had things to do, not to mention that her toes and fingers were becoming decidedly cold, and a few moments inside a shop would be welcome. He smiled a slow, lazy smile at her. "We would not want that, would we?" "No, we would not," she said curtly. "Although," he said, his smile growing, "I would not mind having brothers so well-to-do as Bingley and Darcy." Mary shifted uneasily. "In that case, Mr. Wickham, if you will not move, I will have to take my chances crossing the road again and go find my sisters." He chuckled and finally stepped to the side to allow her passage. Mary huffed. "Truly you are a most perverse man," she muttered as she passed him. He grabbed her by the arm. "I would mind my tongue if I were you." His tone was nearly as pleasant as it had been a moment before, but his eyes spoke darkly, causing a shiver to skitter up her spine. Mary tugged her arm away from him. "And I would mind my manners if I were you." She allowed the anger and frustration she was feeling to shine brightly in her eyes. Again he laughed, but at least he turned and left her alone. She watched him move down the street for 3 rather loud beats of her heart, before scurrying into Mr. Elbeck's shop and placing her order for flour, sugar and tea. After a few minutes of standing in the warmth of the shop and rubbing her fingers to warm them, while her nerves regained their calm, she peeked cautiously out the door. Confident that she would be accosted by neither curricle nor infuriating officer, Mary hurried down the street to visit Mr. Fitzhugh and order the ham. Chapter 4. 2 days later, as her elder sisters sat happily in the sitting room at Longbourn, attended by Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley, Mary slipped out Longbourn's back door to find a reprieve from her mother's looks and comments. She waved to John, one of Longbourn's servants, who was returning to the stables, and had turned, probably to see who was following him, alerted to her presence by the crunching of her feet on the cold ground. She rubbed her hands together to warm them a bit, and then, determined to make her body produce its own warmth, she quickened her steps toward the back field that lay empty, save for the remains of plants poking up in rows from the sleeping earth. This field would take her closest to Rosemore. She often strolled down its length, frequently imagining doing so on the arm of a particular gentleman. Today she conjured the same images again and proceeded to have a lovely chat with the imaginary Mr. Hammond. It was no trial to speak with him in reality, but speaking as she was now, when she could control both sides of the conversation, was even more pleasant. At the hedge border of the field she turned right and continued on for a few more paces before stopping to look off into the distance and think. The hedge beside which she stood was not very tall, and standing just where she was now and looking directly to her left, she could catch a glimpse of Rosemore in the distance. She was just beginning to ruminate on the trials that faced the master of that estate, when 4 horses and riders barreled across the adjoining field. Each rider lay low on his mount's neck. The lead rider glanced back toward the others in an attempt to assure himself that he had the lead. Mary watched them for a moment, before turning back to her view of Rosemore and her thoughts of Mr. Hammond. "Jump it," Whit shouted to Fred, nodding to the hedge to their right. £3 says you can clear it." "4 says he cannot," shouted Wickham. "You will owe me £4, Wickham." Fred circled his horse to the right, lining the animal up to make an attempt at clearing the hedge. "He'll never make it," Wickham shouted to Whit as Fred sped past them. "He can, and he will." Whit countered as Fred's horse rose into the air, cleared the low hedge and came to an abrupt stop. Mary saw the horse only a moment before it rose in the air. She had been so caught in her imagination, and so certain the horses would stay to their path, racing along the adjoining field, that she had not expected one of them to approach her. With a startled cry, Mary jumped to the side, but not with any sort of grace. Her ankle rolled, sending her sprawling on the ground. The hedge snagged her bonnet as she fell, yanking it from her head and freeing a hairpin or two, so that a portion of her hair fell in waves to her shoulders. "Blast," she muttered, as she sat up and rotated one wrist and then the other. They hurt, but had not sustained any significant damage from catching her on landing. Her gloves, however, were not so fortunate. One had a rip across the palm, and both were covered in soil, as was her skirt, which she flicked quickly to cover her legs. "Are you injured?" Fred knelt beside her. "I did not see you there." He took Mary's arm as she attempted to rise with some grace. "My glove is ruined." She winced as she stood. "And my ankle." "Ooh." She moaned a bit as she tried putting her weight on it. It was tender but not broken. Fred wrapped an arm around her waist. Mary pulled away. "Sir, please." "I only wish to help." "Then fetch my hat, while I straighten my clothing and assess if there are any further injuries." She gave him a stern look that begged him to comply. It was the look she had used with limited success on Lydia. Thankfully, this handsome young man did not seem so stubborn as her younger sister and complied. Mary brushed dirt from her skirt and took a limping step. Her left hip was nearly as sore as her ankle. "I'm only a little worse for the wear," she said as the young gentleman handed her the bonnet. There was a small hole in it from where the branch had caught it, and a piece of lace dangled in the breeze much as her unfastened tresses did. Knowing that without the aid of a mirror and brush there was no way to restore her hair to its former state, she pulled the remaining pins from her coiffure and combed it out with her fingers. The bonnet, thankfully, could be made marginally presentable, so she poked the end of a piece of lace into the hole. Turning the hat this way and that, she surveyed it, and, satisfied that it would serve its purpose without looking too hideous, tied it on her head. "You landed it!" Whit exclaimed, as he, Wickham, and another officer approached the hedge. "Collect my winnings," Fred shot back, a smile spreading across his face. "A wager?" Mary's hands rested on her hips. "I was nearly killed because of a wager?" Fred's face wore a pained expression, as she skewered him with a glare. "I promise that I did not see you." "A wager?" she said again in disbelief as she shook her head. "Your winnings," she continued as anger rose within her, "can be used to replace my gloves." She tipped her head to the side and with brows furrowed scrutinized him. "You are not with the regiment, are you?" He shook his head. "I am home on holidays to visit my brother." "Ah!" Her eyes grew wide. That was why he looked so familiar. He was as tall as his brother. However, his frame was more slight, and his eyes were not so much green as brown, though his hair did have a bit of an auburn tinge. "Mr. Alfred Hammond?" she inquired. His expression was once again pained as he nodded. "If I replace your gloves, you'll not tell my brother I nearly killed you, will you? He's already a bit put out with me." Her lips pursed. "I can well imagine there is a good reason." She turned toward the others that had joined them on the opposite side of the hedge. "Lieutenant Wickham," she greeted. "Captain Denny." Both men bowed from their seat. Wickham, she noted, looked particularly amused. "Mr. Whitmore," said the third gentleman, removing his hat and bowing with a flourish. "And you are?" "Miss Mary Bennet," she replied. "Mr. Whitmore is a friend of yours?" she asked, turning to Fred. "He is indeed, and has joined me on my holidays." Mary nodded her head, and her brows flicked upwards quickly. Mr. Hammond had not been expecting his brother, let alone his brother and a friend. Knowing that the school term would not yet be over, Mary suspected that both Mr. Fred Hammond and Mr. Whitmore, the gallant young man with the fine blue coat and wavy blonde hair, had been sent home due to poor behaviour. This in turn meant that Mr. Whitmore was not so much visiting Rosemore as he was using it to hide from his father. "You'll not tell Nick of this, will you?" Fred inquired again. "I have not decided," said Mary firmly. "It was merely a friendly wager," he said. He seemed to sense her opposition to gambling. It was a hideous habit in her mind, a waste of money that often led to ruin. She dipped a shaky curtsy. "I will consider it as I await my new gloves." She turned to begin the long and painful trek back to the house. With any luck, she would be able to slip in without drawing any notice. "Allow me to see you home." Fred took her elbow. "You may ride and I will walk." "I'm not dressed for riding, and much like you, I do not relish the thought of being lectured, which I will be if I return in the company of a gentleman." "But you're injured, and my friends can come around the hedge and go with us to vouch that nothing untoward happened." Mary laughed. "Yes, because returning in the company of 4 gentlemen looking as I do would be much more acceptable." Fred whistled to his horse. "Please, allow me to assist you." Mary sighed deeply. "Very well." She stood with her arms crossed while he brought his horse over. Then, with a good deal of assistance from Fred, she seated herself on the animal. "This is the second time I have met you unaccompanied," said Wickham, riding up beside her. "Is it a habit you practice regularly?" "Seeing as both times I've been nearly killed, I do think it is a habit that will be ending. The good Lord does not need to speak thrice." "You were nearly killed before?" Fred looked up at her. "Yes, 2 days ago in Meryton," Wickham laughed. "Also your doing, Fred, my boy. May I present the lady who narrowly dodged your curricle?" Fred grimaced. "You won't tell my brother about that either, will you? He'll never let me get my curricle back, even if I do manage to find a way to make the money needed to cover its repairs." Mary shook her head. Poor Mr. Hammond to be saddled with such a brother as this. It was as bad, if not worse, than having Lydia for a sister. "If you can find a way to earn the money without laying a bet, I will keep my silence." She did not like the idea of concealing a matter. However, if through this bargain she could assist Mr. Hammond, she would endure the guilt. "You're studying for the law, are you not?" Fred looked surprised that she would know, but agreed that he was. "My uncle, Mr. Phillips, is a solicitor, and he may have some clerking work you could do. His clerk's mother is ill, and he has gone to visit her." "A country solicitor," Fred scoffed at the idea, which did not please Mary. "It is your choice." Though she wished to berate him, Mary kept her tone even. If a country solicitor does not meet your qualifications, you can find some other form of employment, but know that in 4 days' time, if I do not have new gloves and you do not have an honest way of earning money, I will speak to your brother." Fred cursed softly under his breath, but Mary heard it and smiled inwardly. "Very well, I shall call on you with gloves and my prospects in 4 days." "Good. Now, if you would be so kind as to allow me to hobble the rest of the way to the house, I might avoid some displeasure myself." Thankfully, Fred complied and helped her down from his horse. "Mary!" Elizabeth had caught sight of her and was nearly running towards her from the side garden. "Blast!" muttered Mary. "My sister Elizabeth," she explained. Then, casting a glance to Wickham, whose view to the side garden was obscured by a bush, added, "And Mr. Darcy." It should not have made her feel so delighted to see him blanch, but it did. "What has happened?" asked Elizabeth as she reached Mary. "I fell," said Mary, "and these gentlemen were kind enough to assist me home." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she assessed the group. "Where were you?" "At the far end of the field, and they were riding on the adjacent land. It was very fortuitous that they were there to assist me." She tried to keep from wincing at the statement. She was apparently not successful, for her sister's eyebrows rose, and disbelief shone in her eyes. However, rather than questioning further, Elizabeth wrapped an arm around Mary and moved her forward a few steps toward the house and away from the group of men. "Mary fell, and those gentlemen helped her home," Elizabeth explained to Darcy, with a nod toward the group. Mary watched Darcy's face grow hard as his eyes landed on Wickham. "I know Wickham and Denny, but who are these other gentlemen?" To Mary it sounded as if the word gentleman was one Darcy used reluctantly. "Mr. Alfred Hammond, Mr. Hammond's younger brother, and Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Alfred Hammond's friend." "We thank you for your assistance, of course," said Elizabeth. "Indeed, we do," said Darcy. "Of course, you'll return the way you came. We cannot have 4 gentlemen on horses parading through the yard, you understand, I'm sure." His voice was harsh and demanding. "Can we not stop to pay our respects to the other Miss Bennets?" Wickham asked. Mary was certain from the look on the man's face that it was only said to goad Darcy. "If you wish to leave as you came and then approach the house from the drive as is proper, I cannot stop you. Perhaps we will." Wickham smiled, gave a bow of his head in farewell, and turned his horse to leave. Mary stood with her sister as the 4 riders left. "Now," said Elizabeth, "you can tell us what actually happened." "I am not sure I can, since I may have made a promise not to do so," said Mary sheepishly. "We can keep a secret," encouraged Darcy, following them to a bench that stood outside the door to the kitchen. Mary gratefully sank onto the bench. "You must not say a word for 4 days." Darcy and Elizabeth agreed, and Mary shared the entire tale from Curricle in Meryton to the horse flying above her at the end of the field. Chapter 5. "Fred," Nicholas called as his brother passed the door to his study. He had left it open, with the intent of catching his brother before the good-for-nothing could slip away to participate in some other form of self-created sport. Nicholas closed his eyes and rubbed his right temple as his brother entered the room. There was a pain beginning to thrum just there. "Whitmore too," he added without opening his eyes. He waved his free hand toward the chairs in front of his desk. "Close the door and sit." At the soft tick of the door latching, he opened his eyes and shook his head. The pair settling uneasily into the chair before him had not been at Rosemore for 4 days yet, and already he wished them gone. "I have had 2 unpleasant calls today." Fred cast a glance at Whit before cocking his head to the side and feigning nonchalance. Nicholas could tell that his brother was not completely at ease because he was not slouching. Fred and Whit were both perfectly seated, backs erect, feet firmly planted on the floor, hands clasped loosely in their laps. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed them. The information he had received must be true. He drew a breath and released it loudly, doing little to dispel the frustration he felt. Being sent home from school and damaging a curricle paled in Nicholas's mind, compared to endangering the life of a young lady. "Mr. Elbeck's man delivered my order. I understand business is brisk this time of year, with preparations by many for Christmas celebrations and visits by family." He stopped and drew another deep breath in an effort to keep his emotions regulated. And yet, in the midst of holiday preparations and goodwill, someone in a fine carriage had the audacity to fly down High Street, causing unsuspecting shoppers to scurry to safety. Fred pulled the corner of his lower lip between his teeth slightly. It was nearly unnoticeable unless you were watching for it as Nicholas was. It was a small admission of guilt and meant it was the rest of the story that had his brother nervous. Nicholas lowered the volume of his voice, attempting to contain his displeasure and remain composed. You get sent home for driving recklessly, and still you insist on behaving without thought? I drove a bit fast. Fred shrugged a shoulder as if it were not a matter of significance. Perhaps on a road that is not crossed by ladies on their way to order supplies for their households, it could be acceptable on occasion, but not where you might injure or kill someone. Nicholas rose from his chair. The anger he had felt upon hearing that his brother had endangered the life of anyone, let alone a lady like Mary Bennet, had finally defeated his resolve to remain calm. Everyone is well, Fred argued weakly. No thanks to you, Nicholas snapped. What if Miss Mary had not been able to scamper across the street so quickly as she did? Then what? But she did. Fred crossed his arms and gave his brother his best defiant stare. You are fortunate, growled Nicholas. The muscles of his arms and back clenched tightly against the urge to pluck his careless brother from his chair and... Well, he was not sure what he would do once he had his hands on his brother, but he knew it would not be pleasant. He had not been this angry with Fred in quite some time, if ever. And so, to keep from doing as he wished, Nicholas clasped his hands behind his back as he leaned against his desk in front of Fred. At this point, I'm uncertain as to whether or not you can be trusted with any vehicle. Fred felt the threat and shifted uneasily beneath his brother's glare. Luck tends to favour me. Yes, I suppose it does, although it would not need to favour you so often if you would think before acting. Nicholas held up his hand to forestall any reply. Let me clarify. If you would think of anything or anyone other than yourself and your own pleasure. He folded his arms across his chest. Mr. Holwood was my second caller today. He tells me that 4 young men, one being my brother, were riding in one of his fields. Let me remind you that Holwood does not approve of trespassing. He called to inform me that he will shoot the man or horse that does so again. He shook his head. Mr. Holwood was a gruff old man with little tolerance for foolishness of any sort. It was something Fred should know since his leg bore a scar given to him by one of Holwood's dogs. Not mortally, he assures me. However, his eyesight is not what it once was. We can ride elsewhere, Whit offered. Nicholas nodded. As much as he wished to be rid of both Fred and Whit, he did not want them injured or worse. That would be wise. He tipped his head. You may wish to inform your friends as well, and stay off of Bennet's property. Rosemore has fields enough for a good gallop, as well as a hedge or two for jumping. There is no need to stray onto other land. After both men had assured him they would ride only on Rosemore's land, Nicholas dismissed them. So far, no one had been injured, nor had Nicholas been asked to pay a new bill, so, no matter how much he might wish to rant and rail at them, there was not much left about which to scold them. He prayed it would remain so, as he pulled his last account book for the day in front of him, and with a sigh began his review of the numbers. These were numbers that a wife should be checking, but as long as his brother and father continued to be foolish, a wife was not yet a luxury he could afford. Dresses, hats, children. Unfortunately for him, marriage was too expensive a venture at present. He twirled his pen in his hand and allowed himself a few moments to consider what having a wife and children might be like at this time of year. Greenery would fill the sitting room, giggles of children excited over gifts and treats would echo in the halls. He smiled, kissing boughs would hang in doorways, and he would see to it that a sprig of mistletoe would be in his drawer, so that when Mrs. Hammond brought these accounts to him for a review, he would have an excuse to ignore the numbers for a moment or two. He sighed. The thoughts were lovely, but they were merely a dream at present. Maybe in the new year he could find a way to increase his holdings enough to make it a possibility. Of course, funds would still need to be available to care for his relations, so the lady he chose to marry would have to be frugal and sensible. This thought caused him to frown at first. A frugal and sensible wife did not sound like one that would be pleasant or pretty. However, as the lovely face of a very sensible young lady came to mind, a smile replaced his frown for a moment as he pondered the thought of her sitting beside him. It was a thought that he found quite pleasant, if he were to be honest. But since she did not have a fortune, and his holdings were not what he wished them to be, such a contemplation was out of the question at present. Maybe if he did well for 2 years. He pushed the distraction of Mary Bennet from his mind and turned it back to the numbers before him. An hour later, as his stomach rumbled, telling him that it was nearly time for dinner, He stacked his books neatly on his desk, tidied up his papers, and tucked his pen and ink into a drawer. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, and after closing the study door, he tossed it over his arm and proceeded toward the stairs. "You didn't see her as I did," Nicholas heard Fred say as he passed the library. The comment caused him to stop outside the door and lean against the wall. This was often how he had learned things about his brother. Nicholas's footsteps were soft, and Fred was careless about closing doors. Before she put her bonnet back on, she took down her hair. Brown waves of the finest chocolate wit, that is what it was. And as she ran her fingers through it, I could think of nothing more than doing the same with mine. Wit laughed. "You'll not have any luck with her. She did not look pleased by you at all. She's far too sensible, Fred." Fred sighed loudly. "But her curves, Wit, thin waist, round hips, and—" There was a snicker from Wit. "Enjoyed helping her mount your horse, did you?" "I would enjoy helping her mount more than my horse," Fred replied. Nicholas clenched his jaw and barely held himself in his place against the urge to throttle Fred when both men inside the room laughed heartily at the comment. To speak of a young woman in such a fashion was beyond the pale. "She's not a shopkeeper's daughter, Fred," Wit cautioned. "Dallying with a gently bred lady is not wise. It often leads to marriage." Fred sighed loudly. "I suppose her stern looks would grate eventually, causing the pleasure of her charms to wane." "Wickham said her younger sisters are just as charming and much less austere," Wit said. "Although it did sound as if we would need to convince them that gentlemen's clothing is preferable to a uniform." Nicholas's breath caught in his chest. They were not speaking of Miss Mary, were they? Fred agreed with this statement and then added, "At least there are two sisters, so we will not have to battle each other." "Shall we make a visit to Longbourn tomorrow, then?" inquired Wit. Nicholas closed his eyes as his heart sank at the realization that his brother was indeed speaking of Miss Mary. "We haven't had an introduction," said Fred. "No, but Wickham has," Wit replied. "Do you think he will help us?" Wit laughed. "He thinks he is beyond competition with his easy manners and uniform. He'll have no idea he is assisting us, especially if you hint that it is the stern sister you wish to see undone." Nicholas pushed himself off the wall and down the hall toward the stairs. "I'll take my meal in my room," he said to Mr. Fraser. He simply could not bear to look at his brother after hearing such a conversation. Surely Miss Mary would not fall for a foolish pup like Fred. She knew of his reckless nature. Yes, he assured himself, she would be safe. Her sisters, however, were not so sensible. This thought caused him to stop on the stairs. He turned to go back down and confront his brother, but thinking better of it, he resumed his path to his room. It was often not best to act in haste. Words would be flung about, and Fred would likely become defiant out of spite. Standing in the place of a father to one's brother was no easy task. It was even more challenging when one's father was still quite alive, since his presence negated any authority one might attempt to wield to curb reckless behaviour in a significant fashion. Nicholas would think on it tonight, and tomorrow, if Fred and Wit went calling at Longbourn, he would join them. Perhaps he could speak to Mr. Bennet. No, he shook his head as he entered his room. Mr. Bennet was a pleasant enough fellow, but he did not appear to be the sort that would be overset by some young bucks wishing to call on his daughters. He would likely wave away the concern that anything untoward would happen, and Mrs. Bennet, Nicholas shook his head and rolled his eyes, she would assist his brother in compromising her daughter if it meant another one of them was married off. He rang the bell for Walters to assist him in changing into riding clothes. A short ride towards Netherfield to look at that land. He paused, his shirt hanging half over his head. Bingley or Darcy. He would speak to them. They were both men of sense and would likely understand the danger. Could he call on them this evening? He would be riding in that direction. "Are you stuck, sir?" Walters chuckled as he tugged the shirt the rest of the way off of his master. "I was just lost in thought," Nicholas replied. "Do you suppose it would be too late to call on a gentleman you are little known to after dinner, if you felt you had something rather urgent to share?" "I could not say," replied Walters. "You can say," retorted Nicholas. "If you say so, sir. In that case, I would hope to see this gentleman on my ride. That way I would not have to guess at what a particular gentleman would find acceptable or not." "You know you are of very little use," muttered Nicholas. "I could not say, sir," replied Walters. "However, had I not appeared when I did, you might still be stuck in your shirt." "I should sack you," Nicholas said with a laugh. "But I dare say I could not find a man of your calibre, such that it is to replace you at the salary I give." "I could not say, sir," replied Walters. Nicholas chuckled. Walters was a good man who was willing to say only so much as necessary, and never carried a morsel of news to the rest of the house or neighbourhood. Such loyalty was not something Nicholas would dismiss on a whim. He allowed Walters to finish his job and then settled into a chair with a book to wait for his dinner to arrive. "Where will you be riding, sir?" Walters paused at the door with Nicholas's soiled clothes draped across his arms. "If I do not return, send the search party toward Netherfield. There is a piece of land I wish to look at once again before I approach Bingley." He knew he did not need to explain his reasons to the man, but Walters was trustworthy and the closest thing he had to a confidant. "I have heard below stairs that Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy often ride after dinner, sir. It is suspected that it is to get away from the sisters." A small smile tipped up the corners of Walter's mouth. "I shall bear that in mind," replied Nicholas. Perhaps it would not only be his brother that luck would favour, but, as luck would have it, Nicholas returned from his ride without having seen either of the gentlemen he wished to see. However, he was not entirely outside of luck's circle of friends, for just past midnight, when Nicholas was just beginning to fall asleep, rain began falling and continued for the entirety of the next day, confining his brother to the house. Chapter 6. Nicholas waited for Fred and Whit to take their seats in the family box. Fred had not been pleased to be roused from sleep so early to attend church. He had assumed that with rustication in the country came an opportunity to ignore the responsibilities of Advent. That might be true when he was in Bath with his father, who only occasionally darkened the door of a church, but in Hertfordshire, while under the auspices of his brother, Fred would be rising for service. And so would any trouble-making friend he brought home with him. It was obvious to Nicholas that both gentlemen could benefit from some moral teaching. He greeted the Bennets as they entered and took their places a row ahead and across the aisle. "Wickham was not exaggerating," whispered Fred. "The younger ones are very pretty." Nicholas skewered his brother with a displeased look. "Not in church," he growled close to his brother's ear after he took his seat. "You're here for the scripture reading and sermon, not the young ladies." "I am merely enjoying the beauty that God provides," Fred returned with a smirk. Nicholas tugged at his jacket and cast a glance toward the Bennet's box. There was certainly plenty of beauty seated there. His eyes rested on Mary. A certain curiosity about what her hair looked like without cap and pins had poked its way into his mind more than once since he had heard his brother's exclamations about her beauty. He pulled his eyes away and leaned closer to his brother. "You may admire, but do try to keep your thoughts pure." Fred made a choking coughing noise and surprise suffused his face. "Is there a problem?" Nicholas asked, knowing full well what his brother had found both shocking and amusing. No, Fred managed with a shake of his head. "It is just that I had not thought that—" "You had not thought I might consider a lady in such terms?" He shrugged. "It is not something I regularly do, but—" He opened his prayer book to the indicated page and nodded for his brother to do the same. It was a moment before Fred complied, for he seemed lost in thought as he looked at his brother with a new curiosity. Many minutes later, as the parson read his sermon, Fred's curiosity overcame him, and he whispered, "Then why do you not marry? You have your inheritance." Nicholas shook his head and attempted to return his thoughts to the message, but his brother's elbow poking his side made that rather difficult. Finally, after the fourth jab and the imploring look which accompanied it, Nicholas leaned toward his brother and whispered, "Money. You and father like to spend my inheritance in such a style that a wife is not affordable. You get a curricle. Mother gets a new hat to please father. Father buys a new book and a new set of clothes while ordering new furnishings, and I must give up my wife." He raised a brow. "Now please pay attention." Whether his brother actually paid attention to the sermon or the prayers or the lighting of the candles, Nicholas was not certain. But what he did know was that Fred remained silent for the remainder of the service and was even a bit subdued as they rose to leave. "Have you considered anyone in particular?" Fred asked as they exited the church. "Pardon me?" Nicholas asked in surprise. "Have you considered anyone for a wife?" Fred repeated, clarifying his meaning. "There is no point in looking at a horse if you cannot buy it." He would not tell his brother that he had surveyed the young ladies of Meryton 3 years ago, and found a few who he had deemed companionable. However, he had not thought himself ready to settle down so soon after leaving school, and so had not pursued any in earnest. Then, within a year of completing his schooling, Nicholas's father had decided to retire to Bath, leaving Rosemore with all its lands and finances to his son to manage. It was then that Nicholas had given up the thought of marrying altogether after reviewing the books. They were in shambles. There was money to be had, but it had not been managed as it should have been, and debts had been acquired because of it. It had only been in the last year that finances had become such that he had begun to see marriage as a possibility. However, it was only recently. He smiled, last Sunday to be precise, that he'd even begun to entertain the notion of taking a wife sooner than planned. Mrs. Bennet had made him consider it when she put Kitty forward as a possibility. He stopped and turned toward his brother as the thought of Mary crossed his mind, followed closely by the conversation he had overheard. "Your inheritance is not large," he said, "so you will need to see yourself well established before you take a wife for yourself." He swallowed, for the thought of his brother marrying did not sit well. Fred was too young, and any lady, even the youngest Bennets, deserved better than a young scamp. "Rosemore will only support you until you have completed your schooling or are dismissed without hope of return. Then, according to what father has written, you must make your own way with your continued allowance, of course, and the use of the house in town, if you so choose." Fred smiled. "I shall be spending time with father in Bath for a time before I take up my profession." Nicholas stepped closer to his brother and lowered his voice. "That all changes if you dally with a lady and end up forced to wed." He glanced to where the Bennet daughters stood with their mother, who was talking once again in a shrill voice to Mrs. Long. "Once you have a wife, there will be additional expenses and children. You cannot pay your own bill to repair your curricle. How do you expect to support a family?" "Father would not cut me off," said Fred defiantly. Nicholas raised his eyebrows and shrugged. "Father might not, but I will." He knew his father would likely protest, and Fred would not be allowed to be entirely cut off. But the idea of it being a possibility was enough, he hoped, to cause his brother to pause and consider his ways. Shock once again spread across his brother's face. "I will not be forced to wed." "See that you are not," replied Nicholas. "If I cannot support a wife of my own, you know I will not support one for you." "I should be surprised if you could ever find a wife," snapped Fred. "You're as much a curmudgeon as old Holwood." He turned to leave, but Nicholas grabbed his arm. "Do not mistake me, Fred. I care for you as I do the rest of my family. I have placed my desires and wishes behind yours, but I will not continue to do so if you continue to act the fool. Actions have consequences." He dropped Fred's arm. "And not all of them are pleasant or suffered only by you. Consider that." Fred studied Nicholas' face for a moment before giving a sharp nod of his head. "Mr. Hammond," Mr. Bennet approached Nicholas with a weary look, "my wife would like an introduction to your companions." Nicholas smiled. He knew exactly what Mrs. Bennet wished to know. "My younger brother Fred," Nicholas said with a wave of his hand in Fred's direction. "Second son, small inheritance, studying the law, and will one day have a brilliant practice if he applies himself to it." Mr. Bennet chuckled. "You know my wife well." Nicholas tipped his head in acknowledgement of the fact and continued. "Mr. Ethan Whitmore, first son, good inheritance, including an estate in Kent. Just an acre or two larger than Longbourn, currently studying with my brother, and only faces a life in the Navy if he continues to enjoy his time at school so much as he has been." Mr. Bennet's brows rose, and a knowing smile curled his lips. "I had thought it early to be home from school," both young men greeted Mr. Bennet sheepishly. "My wife will see no fault in a bit of frivolity, gentlemen," Mr. Bennet continued with a tone a bit more stern than Nicholas would have expected from the jovial gentleman. "However, I'm not as silly as my wife." He bowed to Fred and Whit. "Hammond, you and yours are welcome to call at Longbourn so long as frivolity is not at play where my daughters are concerned." "Thank you, sir," Nicholas replied as Mr. Bennet made a waving motion at his wife, and she, with 3 of her 5 daughters trailing behind, came to be introduced. Nicholas watched the introductions. They went nearly as he had expected. Miss Lydia and Miss Kitty fluttered, smiled and curtsied as any debutante might, but Mary seemed to be strangely uneasy. Perhaps she feared being made a fool again this Sunday. He tried to catch her eye, but she would not look at him. Nicholas stood where he was, watching his brother and Whit wander away with the Bennets. "I see your brother and his friend have been introduced to my sisters," Elizabeth said after Darcy had greeted Nicholas. "You have met my brother and Whit?" Nicholas asked in surprise. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed. "Mr. Darcy and I met them when they were out riding the other day." Nicholas's brow rose just slightly. "So, Hallward's eyes are not so dim as he might claim. He told me that he saw them cross from his field to one of your father's. "Jumping a hedge, I believe he said." He smiled at Elizabeth. "I have warned them off." His eyes followed his brother, who was dividing his attention between Miss Kitty and Mary. His eyebrows drew together. "Has Miss Mary injured her leg?" he asked. "I beg your pardon," said Elizabeth. She stumbled just there, and Fred caught her elbow. "She fell and wrenched her ankle," said Darcy. "She insists it is healing well," he added, as Bingley and Jane, followed by Caroline, joined the group. "Mr. Hammond," greeted Bingley with an outstretched hand. "Miss Mary says you wish to speak to me about a field." Nicholas smiled. He had known she would help his cause. "I most certainly do. Would one day this week be convenient? I am at Longbourn on the morrow, and then Miss Jane and Miss Elizabeth will be at Netherfield on Tuesday. That might be the best day then." Bingley turned to Caroline. "Can you arrange tea for us all?" Caroline smiled and dipped her head demurely while casting a glance toward Nicholas. "Indeed, I can. It is not so large a party. The ball was much larger and a great success." "Yes, I'd heard it was," said Nicholas with what he hoped was a charming smile. He did not particularly like Miss Bingley and her machinations any more than Mrs. Bennet's. "Estate business kept me from it, but for me it is enough to hear about the event. I'm not partial to balls or soirees, you see." He hoped that would dissuade her pursuit. Caroline blinked. "You would not say so if you had been to a ball such as we held. I dare say it was as good as, if not better than, any we have been invited to in town. Have you ever attended one in town? I assure you that they are much different from a country assembly." Nicholas nodded. "I have attended many, and although it has been several years ago now, I must say I prefer our small assemblies to those crushes." He shrugged. "But then, I do prefer the country. In fact, I would let the house in town go if it were not for my brother needing it when he begins his career." The horror of such a thought was clearly written on Caroline's face. "Let the house in town go? To remain in the country?" Nicholas nodded. "It is what I prefer." "Oh," said Caroline, "I have never heard such a thing. I do apologise for my shock." "There is no need to apologise, Miss Bingley," said Nicholas with a tone of compassion that he did not particularly feel. "I know I am a bit of an oddity, but there you have it." "It is not so very odd," said Darcy. "It is what I also prefer, but things are such that I do not have the luxury of remaining in Derbyshire. My sister must have her education, and then there is the matter of her come out." Nicholas smiled sympathetically. He was grateful that he had a younger brother and not a younger sister, for a younger brother could be left to make his way in society. "You will soon have help," he smiled at Elizabeth. "That must be a comfort." "That I will." Darcy's face beamed with joy, and Nicholas felt a stab of jealousy, not because he wished to marry Elizabeth, but because he might never marry at all. "Surely, Mr. Darcy," said Caroline with a small giggle, "you cannot be serious. What does Miss Elizabeth know of town?" "Enough," said Bingley firmly. "She and Miss Bennet know enough, and are not without the intelligence to learn whatever they may need to learn." Nicholas bit the insides of his cheeks. Darcy's look of surprise at such a statement from his friend confirmed what Nicholas had thought of Bingley. Bingley was easy-going to a point, but beyond that, as any good businessman should be, he was immovable. "And we will have Mary to assist as well," said Elizabeth with a smile at Jane. Nicholas blinked, his mind snapping back to the conversation as his eyes sought Mary before focusing on her sister Elizabeth. "I beg your pardon?" "We wish to see our sister have every opportunity to make a good match," explained Jane. "Indeed," said Darcy, "and I believe Miss Mary will be a good friend for Georgiana." "Miss Mary will be staying with you?" Nicholas could not imagine Mary in the throngs of people at London soirees. Mary barely tolerated the small soirees of Hertfordshire. "Eventually," said Darcy. Nicholas's eyebrows drew together as he considered this information. "It makes sense, I suppose. Options are limited here." "Indeed," said Caroline with a snort, earning her a glare from her brother. "I wish her well," said Nicholas with a forced smile. "I shall call on you on Tuesday, Mr. Bingley, although I may see you at Longbourn tomorrow with my brother and Mr. Whitmore." With a bow he took his leave. A strange, unsettled feeling had taken up residence in his stomach. Mary would not do well in town, would she? Would there be gentlemen there who would willingly sit out from dancing and converse about agriculture and science? Or would they all be like his brother, and be interested only in her charms? Chapter 7. The following day, Mrs. Bennet was beside herself with delight when her sitting room began to fill with handsome gentlemen. Mr. Bennet was even called upon to have an extra chair brought from his study, which he placed near Mrs. Bennet. "I do not know why you insist on sitting with us," his wife complained in a loud whisper, as he took his place next to her. "It is not as if you enjoy social calls." Mr. Bennet smiled and patted her arm as one might an overwrought child. "They are my daughters as well as yours. It is my duty to see that the young bucks are acceptable and not just pretty." Mrs. Bennet huffed. "I would not accept any gentleman who was not eminently eligible. These things are best left to the women to decide. Money is merely part of the equation. Take Lizzie. She will have no want of anything except pleasure. Her life will be dull, very dull. Imagine her sitting about at home." She shook her head. "You know how she loves to dance." Mr. Bennet smiled sheepishly at Darcy, who had caught that bit of conversation by the look on his face. "My dear, Lizzie is just as fond of reading and not opposed to spending a quiet night at home. And," he looked at Darcy with a twinkle in his eye, "I suspect she will have many opportunities for dancing, since she will have a new sister to help introduce to society." Mrs. Bennet caught her lower lip between her teeth as her eyes grew wide. She had not thought about Elizabeth's place in society. "Oh my," her fan fluttered rapidly. "If I had but thought. Lydia is more suited for society than Elizabeth." Mr. Bennet grasped his wife's hand and shook his head. "Lydia has little knowledge of society beyond flirting with the uniform, and she is barely out herself. How could she help another her own age? Truly, Mrs. Bennet, you need my guidance more than I had thought. It is very good that I'm here after all." He chuckled at her displeased huff. "I say," he began in a louder voice in his address to the room, "the weather is not too foul at present. The sun shines and the ground is dry. I would suggest a stroll about the garden before tea." There was a general consensus that a walk would indeed be an excellent idea. "But it is cold," complained Mrs. Bennet as her visitors began to move to leave the room. "Surely it would be better to stay inside and have the tables brought out for cards." Mr. Bennet stood and extended the hand to Mrs. Bennet. "Get your warmest wrap, my dear. We should not allow these youngsters to wander about unattended, and a foray into nature is good for the constitution." Mrs. Bennet did not look convinced and sighed in resignation before turning to Mary. "My green wrap?" "No," interrupted Mr. Bennet. "I asked you to get it, not Mary." Mrs. Bennet scowled. "But she will need to get her own, and her room is not far from mine. Besides, it is good training." Mr. Bennet drew his wife to her feet and tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. "I will escort you, my dear." He moved toward the door to the sitting room, and having little other option, she followed. "Jane," Mr. Bennet said, as he and Mrs. Bennet exited the room, "see that everyone is comfortable." He looked past Jane to Mary. "Your mother and I will join you shortly. I expect Mrs. Bennet will wish to check on the arrangements for tea, and there is a small matter I wish to discuss with her." Nicholas watched as Mary's cheeks flushed and her eyes lowered. He was glad that Mr. Bennet was addressing his wife's behaviour. He had noted how Mary had moved quickly to scurry away and get the item that was requested before her father had stopped her with a shake of his head. How she must suffer at the hand of such a mother. It was no wonder she was going to live with the Darcys. The thought that she would have an escape as she wished made him smile, until that unsettled feeling once again formed in the pit of his stomach, twisting and knotting it as it did. He mentally shook himself. Friends had moved on before. This was nothing more than that. He would miss her for a time, but then the efforts needed to keep his estate running well, and his father satisfied with his life in Bath would take over. The thought of such did little to lift his mood as he exited the house and followed the others toward the side garden. There were, of course, no flowers to greet them, but neat hedges and walkways seemed eager to draw them along the paths. It was not a vast garden, but there was ample room for each group of people to find their own small space for conversation. Nicholas had hoped that he might get to speak with Mary, but she had already been claimed by his brother. Wit had Kitty on one arm and Lydia on the other, and was looking rather contented to be so surrounded. "Mr. Hammond, it seems we are left to form the last pair." Caroline smiled coquettishly at him. Nicholas drew a breath and expelled it. He had no desire to escort Miss Bingley around the garden, but to refuse to do so when there were no other gentlemen to provide the service would be rude. So he gave a bow of his head in welcome and offered her an arm. They walked for several paces in silence. Just as Nicholas had no desire to escort Miss Bingley, he also had no desire to speak of trivial things, and he was certain a lady such as Miss Bingley would only be interested in the regular crop of topics: the weather, the latest tidbit of gossip from the village, some comment about the situation of the house being pleasant, or, heaven help him, how lovely the lace was for her new bonnet. He shuddered at the thought and at length decided that if he was to avoid such topics, he must do his part and begin some sort of conversation. "Will you be remaining at Netherfield for long after the wedding?" That should do nicely. It required no discussion of the weather or fashion. "No," said Caroline. "Hurst insists we spend Christmas in town. Charles will join us after the New Year, of course, but Miss Bennet will wish to have this Christmas with her family. Who knows when she might do so again?" The statement startled Nicholas somewhat. Netherfield was but 3 miles from Longbourn. Surely Christmas at such an estate would be preferable to spending it in town. "I do not think my brother will keep Netherfield." Caroline leaned closer to whisper this information as if it was some great secret. "Where Mr. Darcy goes, Charles will follow. He always has. Besides, to be so close to relations such as Mrs. Bennet would be simply out of the question. The demands she would make on him would be great. Town would be a better residence. An estate is not necessary to happiness, you know." "No, actually I do not know," Nicholas replied. He was certain that town would be a better residence for Miss Bingley, but her brother seemed content to be in the country. He suspected that her comments were more to her own benefit than that of her brother. "I find Rosemore to be of great importance to me, and it is where I am happiest." She favoured him with the kind of understanding smile that made him wish to withdraw his arm from her touch. Such airs of self-importance had always been repugnant to him. His father was always affecting them, acting as if he was better than those around him, speaking as if he was the authority on all things proper, and spending as if he had the wealth of Croesus. Such attitudes could only run to ruin. "The country is familiar to you," said Caroline sweetly. Too sweetly, according to Nicholas's sensibilities. "Charles has lived most of his life very differently. I fear he will grow tired of the prosaic life. He does not think so now, of course. It is new, and he is enamoured with Miss Bennet, but—" She said no more, leaving the thought unfinished as if it was only natural for anyone to assume that country life and Miss Bennet would soon be boring to her brother. "I had not taken your brother to be someone who was so capricious." Nicholas tried to keep the edge of displeasure from his voice, but the stammering excuses Miss Bingley began to give him indicated he had not been successful. To be truthful, he was not certain he cared. Perhaps now she would stop batting her eyes at him and acting coy. He preferred a lady, to be honest. Presently Miss Bingley began to shiver. Whether it was from the cold or his reticence to engage in any conversation, Nicholas could not tell, but being the gentleman he was, he offered to see her back to the house. He had no intention, however, of joining her in the sitting-room, which was something that did not overly please her. Again, he did not care. He would not be found unaccompanied in a room with Miss Bingley. He would rather stand outdoors until his fingers and toes broke off from the cold. So, after depositing her at the door to Longbourn with Mr. Hill, Nicholas returned to the garden. Besides wishing to avoid the possibility of being forced into a compromising position with Miss Bingley, he also wanted to make certain that his brother and Wit were not tempting such a fate with any of the younger Bennet sisters. Mary and Fred had stopped a distance away from where Lydia and Kitty entertained Wit. "I spoke to your uncle this morning," Fred said. "He has some work for me to do, but not for a few days." He pulled a package from his pocket. "And I purchased these." Mary smiled and opened the package. "You have worked quickly." Fred glanced over his shoulder. "I did not wish for my brother to know about your accident. He's already hinting that I might not get my curricle returned. It seems some shopkeeper mentioned my driving too fast." Mary chuckled. "That is too bad." "I might believe you if you attempted to sound sincere and did not smile so much," said Fred, "although you are pretty when you smile." Mary raised an eyebrow and gave him a stern look. "I do not flirt, Mr. Hammond," he shrugged. "You cannot fault me for the attempt, I hope." Mary heaved a great sigh and her brow furrowed. "I suppose I cannot, but you should attempt to say things that are not so obviously flattering. Something that is more truthful." "You do not believe yourself pretty?" Fred's eyes were wide with surprise. Mary's responding laugh was bitter. "I have been told I am not." She turned and looked at her younger sisters. "They are. I am not." She pulled off one glove and then the next. Fred watched as she slid her hands into the new gloves, smoothing each finger and then the palms. It was nearly as mesmerizing as it had been watching her run her fingers through her hair the day she fell. This time, he could not keep his hands to himself and without much thought took one of hers in his. Catching himself before he lifted it to his lips, he turned it over and inspected the palm. "No more tear," he commented before releasing it, "and they fit well." Mary clasped her hands together. "They do, thank you." She shifted uneasily. "Perhaps we should join Mr. Whitmore." "No need to worry, Whit's in his element." Mary's eyes narrowed. "Is he? And exactly what element would that be?" Fred swallowed visibly. "He's good at entertaining." "Entertaining?" Mary's eyebrows rose. "Being amiable," Fred elaborated. "That could pose a problem," said Mary, "for my sisters are far too fond of entertaining an amiable gentleman for their own good. We must join them." She accepted the arm Fred offered. "Are you as amiable and entertaining as your friend?" Fred gave her an uneasy sidelong glance. "I am not certain if I should answer that." Mary laughed. "I believe that is answer enough for me." Jane sighed and looked at Elizabeth. "Have you been specific in your prayers?" she asked softly. "Whatever do you mean?" Elizabeth replied. Jane tilted her head towards where Mary stood with Fred holding her hand and looking at her palm. "That is not the right Mr. Hammond." "Hammond?" Darcy asked. "Remember the night of the ball when Mary mentioned that there might be a gentleman who had caught her eye?" Elizabeth responded, ignoring Jane's hiss to keep silent. Darcy's eyes grew wide with understanding. "Mr. Hammond?" Elizabeth nodded. "Jane and I were not to tell anyone or interfere in any way." She gave both Darcy and Bingley a look that begged them to understand and not say a word. "Not a word will pass our lips," Bingley assured her. "Will it, Darcy?" Darcy, however, was not attending. He was staring off toward the entrance to the garden where Nicholas was just making his way back from depositing Caroline in Mr. Hill's care. Darcy shook his head and smiled. "I would not fear too greatly. In fact, his brother might help Mary's cause." "What do you mean?" asked Jane. "I have felt that expression. Have not you, Bingley?" Bingley looked at the scowl Nicholas wore as he hurried toward his brother. Indeed, jealousy is a powerful ally. Chapter 8. "You held her hand," Whit teased Fred as the three gentlemen rode back toward Rosemore. "I thought you were only going to speak with her." Nicholas's scowl deepened, and he purposefully kept his eyes on the road before him, rather than glaring at his brother like he wished to do. She was putting on her gloves. There was a bit of an unusual timbre to his brother's voice. "She has lovely fingers. I would love to watch them. Play the piano. You would love to watch her play the piano. Nothing more," inserted Nicholas, finally allowing himself to turn his displeasure on his brother as he had longed to do all afternoon. First, Fred had walked with Mary. Then he'd held her hand and caused her to laugh and smile, and if that was not enough, Fred had claimed a seat beside her when they had returned to the sitting room. And because of it, Nicholas had been forced to endure yet more time with Miss Bingley. "Or the harp," added Whit with a smirk. "Yes, only musical instruments," Nicholas agreed. "Can I not watch her use her hands to sew?" asked Fred, with a look that clearly said his brother had quite possibly lost his mind. "Or if she's arranging greenery or lighting a candle, might I watch her fingers do that?" Nicholas clenched his jaw in frustration. Why would his brother think that he would be watching Mary do any of those things? Fred would be gone before Christmas, although he supposed the Bennets might bring in some boughs for the wedding breakfast. If you must. His eyes narrowed on his brother's green jacket. "As long as the greenery is not your coat and the candle is in the sitting room full of people." Fred's eyes grew wide. "That is twice in 1 week that you have remonstrated me against dallying with the ladies. One would think that you think me a rake." "Are you not?" Nicholas pulled close to his brother. "You are holding her hand and on short acquaintance." Whit made a strangled coughing sound. "I imagine you're as bad as my brother," Nicholas said, skewering Whit with a displeased look. Honestly, Nicholas did not know why he was so irritable as to accuse his brother or Whit of such things, but he was, and Fred at least seemed to be the cause. The child had always tried his patience. He seemed quite at ease with Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia. He raised a brow and looked at Whit with his jaw set in a harsh line. "You are neither their brother or father," said Fred. "Whether I hold Miss Mary's hand or watch it smooth the lapel of my jacket is of little concern to you." Nicholas grabbed Fred's arm before he could manoeuvre away. She's not like others, and she is my friend. Besides that, you are my brother, and I will not have you married before you can afford to do so without my assistance. So it is of concern to me." "Your friend?" There was a hint of suspicion in Whit's voice. "Yes," said Nicholas. "Miss Mary and I often speak when we meet on the street or at assemblies. She prefers not to dance." "Do you meet with her often?" Whit's tone still sounded doubtful. "Only on occasion," replied Nicholas, "when she's on some errand for her mother, or attending her sisters to the shops in Meryton, or, as I said, at assemblies." "And what do you talk about instead of dancing?" Nicholas considered not answering Whit's question. "Is it something unseemly?" his brother goaded. "Books," Nicholas snapped at Fred. "Miss Mary is an avid reader." "Novels?" Whit had drawn up on the other side of Nicholas. Nicholas shook his head. "I said she was not like other ladies. She reads sermons and books on science and agriculture." "A blue stocking?" Nicholas smiled at his brother's disappointed tone. Maybe this bit of information would keep Fred away from Mary. Whit laughed while studying Nicholas's face carefully. "I believe your brother has the right of it. No matter how lovely her fingers or the shade of her hair," he paused, and then lifted a brow before continuing, "or how pleasing and soft her curves." His face lit with a broad smile at Nicholas's low growl and glare at Fred. "She is not the girl for you, Fred. Far too smart. She'd have you doing her bidding in no time. Imagine she might convince you to actually seek employment instead of pleasure." Nicholas's eyes turned back toward Whit in question. Fred laughed uneasily. "She already has." His sheepish admission took Nicholas by surprise. "She has?" Nicholas asked. Fred nodded slowly. "Miss Mary suggested I seek work with her uncle to earn what I need for the repairs to my curricle. I will have some work to do for him next week." Nicholas rode on silently for a few moments. Miss Mary had convinced his brother to work instead of play. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps Mary was precisely the sort of woman his brother needed. "That is excellent news," he said at last. "Will you be calling on her again tomorrow?" The question tasted bitter in his mouth. "So you approve so long as she is reforming your brother?" Whit said with a laugh. Nicholas shrugged. "No one else has been successful, and my accounts could use the assistance." "You would hand over your friend to him?" Whit waved a hand at Fred, ignoring his friend's protest. "For a bit of blunt?" "It is not like that," snapped Nicholas. "If she is happy, and it betters my brother, then yes, I approve." He swallowed against the urge to spew his tea and biscuits on the road. How could she be happy with a reckless clod like his brother? "This dolt," he nodded at his brother, "is part of the reason I need the blunt." "We will be calling at Longbourn tomorrow," said Whit. "Whether your brother wishes to pursue a blue stocking or not is irrelevant. I find both Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia to my liking, and am having the devil of a time deciding which to favour with my attention." He prodded his horse to walk more quickly. "And I have an estate awaiting me, so I will be able to provide for a wife if either Bennet catches my fancy in that way," he laughed. "Although personally I prefer to play the part of a rake." He clucked to his horse and off they flew. "Wait," Nicholas called before his brother could gallop off. "You'll not hurt her, will you?" Fred shook his head. "I've no intention of hurting anyone." "You never do," said his brother, "just as you did not intend to damage your curricle." "The two are different," protested Fred. "And yet similar," said Nicholas, "because if you cause her injury of any kind, I will see you pay." Fred caught up to Whit as Nicholas galloped past them. "He's more cantankerous than usual." "I had noticed," said Whit. "He's still friendlier than my father would be, so I'll endure it until you leave for Bath." Fred laughed. "You would endure worse just to be near beauties like those Bennet chits." Whit's brows flicked upward, and a sly smile spread across his face. "You know me well. I would advise not playing the part of Lothario when Nick is in a temper." Fred turned toward his friend, who was laughing heartily at his comment. "I would not even play the part of a smitten swain, or you'll find your trunk on the steps and the door locked." He shook his head. "He is rarely bright and cheerful, but seriously, I have not seen him in such a foul mood in years." "You truly do not suspect why?" Whit said in surprise. Fred shook his head. "Normally I can tell what has set him off, but this time I am at a loss." Whit chuckled. "I would enlighten you, but it seems your brother has come back for another go at you." He pointed with his chin to where Nicholas had swung his horse about and was now racing toward them. He tipped his head and studied the horse and rider as they approached. "I think he would beat us all, so if he ever challenges someone, keep that in mind when laying your bet." "So noted." Fred replied with a smile. Nicholas circled and drew his horse up next to his brother. When did you speak with Mr. Phillips? I inquired this morning before breakfast. Nicholas raised a brow in silent question. He begins his work early, says he enjoys the solitude of the morning, Fred answered. Nicholas nodded but remained silent. He still was uncertain when his brother would have spoken to Miss Mary about seeking employment. They had spoken after church, but only for a short period of time. Something did not seem right, and when something did not sit right where his brother was concerned, it was likely because Fred had some transgression he was hiding. However, he also knew his brother did not respond well to interrogation, so, though it hurt to do so, Nicholas remained silent and waited. Miss Mary introduced me to him yesterday after the service. She knew I was studying law and thought he and I might get on well. Nicholas nodded again. How did she know about your curricle? I told her. Oh. Nicholas wished to ask more, but the hint of sharpness in his brother's tone told him that he should return to quietly waiting for information. They rode on for several minutes, Fred casting wary looks toward his brother, and Nicholas simply watching him. Very well, Fred finally said. If you will stop glaring at me, I will tell you that I met her the other day when I was riding and she was walking. Race you to the turn, said Whit, shooting Fred a meaningful look. Fred nodded and set off before his brother could detain him further. Remember what I said about the likelihood of his winning a race, Whit said to Fred as they raced along side by side. It is not only his horse that is quick. How long do you suppose it will be before he figures out that your meeting with Miss Mary and the visit by Mr. Hallward happened on the same day? When he does, he may have more questions. Fred's eyes grew wide, and he glanced back to make certain his brother was not following him. She was on a walk, stumbled, and we stopped to help, he said to Whit. Whit smiled. Very good. Do not tell him any more than that, no matter how much he glares. Whit waited to get a nod from Fred before urging his horse to go faster. Drawing to a stop a short distance from the stables at Rosemore, Whit slid down from his mount and joined his friend. I thought I had you from the jump. Not today. Not ever, Fred returned triumphantly. They walked together to the stables and handed the horses over to a couple of grooms to be cooled down and put away properly. Tell me, said Fred, why is my brother in such a mood? Whit tipped his head and considered the question. How much do you wish to annoy your brother? Fred's brows drew together, and he shook his head. I do not wish to annoy him. It just naturally happens. So, you do not wish to do him harm? No, he is my brother and holds the purse strings. Always about blunt with you two, muttered Whit as they entered the house. Fred shrugged. My father has appointed him my keeper. Whit sighed. Kitty. Pardon. I choose Miss Kitty unless you prefer her. She's not so loud as her sister. Miss Lydia would be good for a tumble, but it is not worth the pleasure to risk having to listen to her every day forever. He shook his head. I honestly do not know how Mr. Bennet does it. Whit turned to Fred. Do you prefer Miss Kitty to Miss Lydia? Fred shook his head. I do not prefer either. Whit tipped his head to the side. Do not tell me you actually prefer Miss Mary. I am not at leisure to prefer anyone. My brother has made that abundantly clear. Why does your brother not marry? Whit shrugged out of his coat and took a seat in the corner of the library. He says that it is because of money. Whit laughed and shook his head. Of course it is. He said it yesterday at church. Fred dropped into a chair next to Whit. The estate is all he thinks of. He shrugged. He is a dour old grump, but his heart is good. I know father spends more than he should. I've seen mother fidget when speaking of spending, so I know it unsettles her. And you add to the worry with careless accidents? Whit's legs were sprawled out in front of him, and his head was resting against the back of the chair as he looked up at the ceiling. I suppose I do, said Fred. What does this have to do with why my brother is so cross? You know how I love to have a grand time, do you not? Whit sat up and leaned toward Fred. I do. We must stop, Whit said. Having fun? Fred asked in surprise. Only reckless fun, which causes your brother to put out unnecessary money. Fred shook his head in disbelief as he stared at his friend. Whit sighed. I believe he wishes to marry. Nicholas? My brother? Fred laughed. How many times has he mentioned the expense of a wife in the last 2 days? It must be at least twice. Whit leaned back again. You should learn to listen for clues, Fred. Your brother wishes to marry, and I believe he wishes to marry Miss Mary. That is why he is so cross. Whit tipped his head to look at his shocked friend, and we are going to help him. Chapter 9. Late the following afternoon, Mary stood to the side waiting her turn to be handed into the carriage. Thankfully, her mother had seen fit to allow them to take it and not walk to Netherfield. The shadows were lengthening and the air was turning decidedly frigid. Nicholas stepped down to stand next to her as he waited for his horse to be brought around. "Were you successful?" She had hoped to see him in the drawing-room before his meeting with Mr. Bingley, but he had been forced to arrive later than he had planned, due to some matter at his estate. "I was. Rosemore will have an additional field come March. I should not say, I suppose, but since you will no doubt be visiting your sisters after they are married, Mr. Bingley has not decided if he wishes to extend his lease past Michaelmas next, and so his plans for the estate lands are not solidified. It is too new a position for him to have gotten his feet under him, which was beneficial to me." He shifted from one foot to the other and laced his fingers together as if making sure his gloves were properly on each hand. "It is a rather cold day," he commented. "It is," Mary replied. "I will be glad to find a place by the fire tonight. With any luck, I will be allowed to read in peace. Does your mother still plague you?" Mary felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. "Not so often as she wishes. Papa has seen to that." "I am glad to hear it." There was a warmth to his words that wrapped their way around Mary's heart. "Your brother tells me he has taken some work with my uncle." Mary bit her lip as the warmth left his expression at the mention of it. She had thought he would be glad to have his brother employed, so the hardening of his features confused her. "I know my uncle is only a country solicitor, and your brother will have higher aspirations, but I thought it might do him good to be useful even if it is in such a position." "About that," Nicholas began. He turned his head to look at her, and, realizing that she'd stepped one step away and was looking flustered, he shifted from the questions he was about to ask regarding how she'd learned of his brother's need for funds. "I thank you for the suggestion. I'm glad to see him using at least some of his time wisely." He studied her. She had lowered her eyes, and he thought he saw a small smile on her lips. His heart clenched, as did his jaw, at the thought that she might actually be considering his brother. His brother! In that case, then, she should know exactly whom she was considering. "I cannot say Fred's aspirations reach further than next week and his trip to Bath. However, should he manage to finish his course, he will be given use of the townhouse in London, although he has told me that he wishes to spend some time with father and mother before he takes up his robes." He thanked the groom for his horse. "I thought it best that you know his plans before becoming too entangled." "Entangled?" Mary's shocked tone stopped his progress toward his horse. Was she not enamoured with his brother? "Forgive me. I saw him holding your hand yesterday and assumed it was given willingly." "No, I did not give him my hand, but he did not impose upon me by taking it. He was inspecting my glove, nothing more." "I do apologize then, Miss Mary." Mary took a step towards him and spoke in a soft voice. "I would not give him my hand." She drew a breath and shook her head. "Your brother is pleasant, but he is young and foolish. I know money runs through his pockets as quickly as water through sand." How could he think she would entertain the notion of marrying such a person? The thought caused anger to flash within her. "I may be young, Mr. Hammond, and in need of a husband, but I am not foolish. In fact, I'm rather sensible. Too sensible if you speak to my younger sisters." Her eyes narrowed. Her anger had cooled a bit, leaving in its wake a pain in her heart and tears in her eyes. "I thought you knew me," she whispered, before she dipped a curtsy, turned quickly, and pushing past Darcy did not wait to enter the carriage. "That did not go as hoped," Darcy whispered to Elizabeth. "No, it did not," Elizabeth agreed. "First he was late, so there was no time for them to talk over tea, and then, whatever that was." "He was late because a ledger went missing from his study," explained Darcy. "Apparently Mr. Fred Hammond and Mr. Whitmore took it upon themselves to begin learning how to keep accounts." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Poor Mr. Hammond." Darcy nodded. "The servant scoured the house looking for the book." Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with amusement. "And where did they find it?" Darcy chuckled. "It and the thieves were in an empty stall in the stables." "Poor Mr. Hammond," Elizabeth said once again. "He did very well to not look ruffled when he arrived." "I think he has come to expect such foolishness from his brother." Darcy led her toward the carriage door. Not that he had a great amount of equanimity. There was a decided edge of agitation to his air when we first began our discussions, but Bingley has a way of soothing ruffled feathers. Elizabeth raised an impertinent brow as Darcy kissed her hand before handing her into the carriage. I imagine he has had plenty of practice, considering who his sister is. I'm certain he has, said Darcy with a chuckle. Then, after casting a look over his shoulder to where Caroline watched from the window, Darcy winked and pulled Elizabeth toward him, just close enough to drop a quick kiss on her lips. He could always use more practice. What do you think? Fred asked, peering over Whit's shoulder as they scanned the columns of numbers in the household accounts. He's an excellent manager, said Whit, scratching a few more numbers onto his paper. Rosemore is solvent and flourishing. He slipped the paper into his pocket as he heard someone approaching. And that is the sort of work I hope that my wife will do. I expect I will have to check the accounts for accuracy and settle the bills, but she will keep them. He nodded to Nicholas and placed the book back on the shelf where they had found it. Did you go through them all? Nicholas asked, taking off his jacket and tossing it into a chair near the window. I thought you intended to call at Longbourn. Whit looked out the window. Blast, that took longer than I expected. I suppose it would not be the thing to call at this hour. Nicholas's brows rose and he gave Whit a look of disbelief. How did you find my work? Well organised and impressively thorough, replied Whit, taking a seat near Fred. I found it confusing, admitted Fred. Father never showed me any of those. Father found them confusing himself, said Nicholas, dropping into his chair with a glass of brandy in his hand. He tipped his head toward the decanter. Help yourselves, but only in small doses. He held up 2 fingers indicating the limit. That is to last me another week. Is everything rationed? Asked Fred as he carefully measured out the allotted amount of beverage. Nicholas chuckled. No, just a few things such as that brandy. It is not the cheap stuff, but rather a small indulgence that allows me to post Father's bills with some semblance of composure. At the moment, the burning of the liquid as it slid down his throat was to help him deal not only with his brother and Whit and whatever scheme they were about, but it was also intended to dull the pang of guilt he felt over having offended Mary. Running an estate seems more involved than I imagined, said Fred. It is work. Nicholas gave his brother an inquisitive look. Why are you finally interested in finances? Women, said Whit. How much do you suppose the expenses of a wife might run? There are dresses, hats, fripperies and the like, not to mention food and parties. Certainly a gentleman would have more callers once there is a lady to entertain the guests, would he not? Nicholas nodded. And children. You mustn't forget that children are a hazard of certain privileges of marriage. He levelled his brother with a stern stare. I am not a rake, muttered Fred. Whit shrugged. I might become one if I cannot find an acceptable wife. Nicholas shook his head. Neither of you are ready to take a wife. Are you? Whit asked, over the rim of his glass. What would be the cost of such a venture? About half the amount I send to Bath. Nicholas emptied his glass and placed it on his desk. Which means, no, I am not. Whit shrugged. It seems to me that you have sufficient to spend that amount. Until a crop does not do well, or Father decides a new mount is needed to parade about town. Whit nodded. So, greater reserves are needed? He also placed an empty glass on the desk. 6 months' worth, would you say? Nicholas blinked and nodded. He had not expected such an astute question from a friend of his brother. As I'm certain you know, I have 2/3 that amount at present. Another season or 2, without any catastrophes from any quarter, and I might be able to consider a bride. He must remember to not drink brandy until all sources of annoyance had left his study next time, for apparently the comforting liquid loosened his tongue. What if we, Whit motioned between himself and Fred, were to assist you, earn a bit to add to the coffers? Would you look for a wife if you had 5 months in reserve? Whit held up a hand. Fred will keep his expenses low, and if we earn a bit of blunt we will donate it to your cause. Why would you do that? Not that I'm opposed to Fred learning to manage his expenses or the idea of a wife, but why should you care if either of those things ever happen? Whit stood and moved behind his chair, ready to take his leave. Rosemore is dull, and you are rather irascible. The right woman could cure both before there is no hope of a recovery. One Mr. Holwood is enough for Hertfordshire, and you're well on your way to becoming every bit as miserable. Whit bowed, and with a nod of his head for Fred to follow, left the room. Grab some coins and your great coat, whispered Whit as they moved down the hall. Wickham will be playing cards tonight, and he is an easy mark. I dare say we can double our money and then arrange for a bigger event where we could win more. That is, if you're up to riding against Wickham." Fred paused to consider the thought. "But if we lose?" "That will not happen. Aside from your brother, you are the best rider I have seen. However, if needed, I will write to my father to cover the expense and take my chances with being sent to sea." He grabbed Fred by the shoulders. "That will not happen, for we will not lose, although tonight you will lose. We must make Wickham think he has a chance against you. A friendly ride out after the game with a small wager, and then we beg him to let us attempt to win it back, along with additional money from his friends." Whit slapped Fred on the back. "If not for that lad carrying the milk, the scheme would have worked on Alston," he chuckled. "Actually, it did work. We just were not allowed to collect. But this time, there will be no lad with milk and no Mr. Frohock to keep us from our winnings and your brother from marrying." Chapter 10. 2 days later, at the top of the field just across from the driveway to Rosemore, Fred and Wickham waited for Captain Denny to drop his handkerchief to signal the start of the race while Captain Saunders collected the wagers. "Is it enough?" Fred asked Whit, who was watching Saunders carefully. Whit held up a hand to keep Fred from speaking further and silently finished counting the money that the band of spectators placed in the bag. He nodded and smiled at Fred. "Just fly like the wind, my friend, and your brother will be leg-shackled in no time." "Over the hedge, down to the tree, 3 circles, and come back," Denny shouted, above the din of voices calling out encouragements to Wickham and taunts to Fred. "No touching the other rider or horse. First to dismount and retrieve my handkerchief from where I drop it will be the winner. Do you both understand the route and the rules?" Receiving a nod of confirmation from each rider, Denny dropped the piece of cloth he held and the race began. "They have gone where?" Mary asked Mr. Hill. Mary had inquired of Longbourn's butler if he knew where her younger sisters might be. Visitors were expected, and Mrs. Bennet was anxious that all her eligible daughters be present, which is to say that Mary, who was the person the callers were actually coming to see, was dispatched to find Lydia and Kitty. "They have gone walking towards Rosemore, miss. They seemed keen to see the young gentleman. I believe that was the reason Miss Lydia insisted on the sprig of mistletoe. I was just about to speak to your father." He stood waiting for Mary to either leave or ask more questions before he continued on to her father's study. "Have they been gone long?" "No, miss, though I waited a few minutes so as not to let them know I had heard. It is better if they do not know your father's source of information." A small smile played at his lips, and a twinkle shone in the eyes over which one eyebrow cocked shrewdly. Mary chuckled. She understood completely. If her younger sisters were to know who had carried the tale, they would become more cautious around the servants, and many of their schemes would not be prevented. "Tell father that I will ask Colonel Fitzwilliam and Miss Darcy if they would like to take a tour of the countryside before tea," she said as she buttoned her pelisse, and Mr. Hill continued on his way. Miss Darcy and the Colonel had arrived at Netherfield yesterday. Last evening Mr. Bingley had hosted a dinner for Darcy to introduce Elizabeth to them, and today Miss Darcy was to spend time with Mary before a dinner was to be held at Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet was displeased that Mary would be designated as Miss Darcy's particular friend. However, she did not wish to insult Mr. Darcy by opposing his decision, and with a hope that perhaps a battle-worn colonel might find comfort in Mary's serious nature, she had resigned herself to allowing Mary to accept the privilege. Not that in doing so she would be above putting either of Mary's younger sisters forward, hence the need for them to be present for tea today. Mary waited at the door until she saw the carriage enter the drive, then she slipped out of the house to meet it. "Colonel Fitzwilliam," she began her request after the proper greetings had been given, "I am wondering if I could impose upon you for some assistance." "I am at your service," he said with a bow. Mary smiled, covering the mortification she felt at having to reveal to Elizabeth's future family the silliness of her sisters. "My younger sisters have gone for a walk, and while I could make excuses and cover their foolishness with some ploy such as they forgot their scarves, I prefer to be honest, no matter the humiliation it might bring." "This sounds serious," said Colonel Fitzwilliam. "They have taken it upon themselves to walk to a neighbouring estate to call on 2 young gentlemen." Mary was glad for the coolness of the day to temper the heat that rose and coloured her cheeks. "Ah," said Colonel Fitzwilliam, "say no more. We know that young ladies can get carried away by emotions." He winked at Miss Darcy, who lowered her eyes. "All is well and good as long as dire consequences can be prevented." He extended a hand to Mary. "Shall we tour the country?" I would like to say it would be a pleasure, but considering the reason, I can only say I am grateful." Mary climbed up into the carriage, and after the top had been lowered and blankets wrapped around to block the nip of the wind, they set off. "We have agreeable weather for a tour," said the Colonel. "A bright sun is not always available at this time of year. I believe that shows the good Lord is with our mission." Georgiana giggled. "My cousin is always waxing eloquent, as if he was older than my uncle." "In experience, I am," said Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Father never saw what I have." Georgiana's face grew serious. "I'm ever so glad you only saw the horror and did not fall victim to it." The muscle in Colonel Fitzwilliam's jaw twitched. "Yes, for that I'm also grateful. But I'm also glad I did not have to return to the battlefield a second time." He smiled at Mary. "It is one of the benefits of having a well-connected Earl as a father." Mary studied his face. She knew from Elizabeth that the Colonel was only 2 years Mr. Darcy's senior, and yet the fine lines that surrounded his eyes and the deep groove between his brows gave him an older appearance that matched the gravity in his eyes. "I've heard some tales, and I'm glad you escaped without physical harm." She held his gaze for a moment longer. He was not unscarred, she was certain of it. No one who cared so well for a ward as he did Miss Darcy could come away from seeing the grisly realities of war without it affecting him on some level. His smile and eyes softened as he nodded his thanks. "Is this all your father's land?" Miss Darcy asked. "No, not all." Mary spent the next few minutes pointing out Longbourn's boundaries and describing Mr. Holwood, whose fields bordered Longbourn's on this side, to her new friends. "Oh, he sounds unpleasant." Miss Darcy's nose scrunched slightly. Colonel Fitzwilliam cleared his throat. "I do apologise. I should not have spoken ill of someone I do not know," said Miss Darcy. "Oh," replied Mary, "you have not spoken amiss. Mr. Holwood can be very unpleasant. He can also be very obliging, but one must pay both him and his property the proper respect he demands. Then all is well." "There are 2 young ladies crossing that field," said Richard, pointing off to their left, "and there is a large group gathered just beyond them, several redcoats by the look of things." Mary sighed. "My sisters, also like officers. Some officers are worthy the recognition," Colonel Fitzwilliam said with a laugh. "Not these," said Mary before she could catch herself. "Forgive me, that is not fair. I am certain there may be 1 or 2 in their midst who are not deplorable. Their colonel seems a fine man, and he is not lax in discipline." Colonel Fitzwilliam turned from watching the group in the field they were approaching to look at Mary. "You do not have a high opinion of the militia?" "I can be too harsh," she replied, her cheeks colouring slightly. "I appreciate their service to the Crown, but the few I have met, one in particular, have not impressed me. I cannot say what it is about Lieutenant Wickham that sets me on edge, but there is something." She now had the full attention of the Colonel, and Miss Darcy had taken to carefully watching the group in the field. "Has he given you reason to distrust him?" The Colonel's tone was pleasant, but his features, his eyes in particular, were sombre. "Only a few comments." "About what?" Mary squirmed slightly under the Colonel's intense scrutiny. "He commented on my being alone on a walk and not caring if rumours spread that would cause a scandal." She looked down at her hands. "He's not interested in me as a person." She looked up at the Colonel, expecting his eyes to be boring into her, but they were not. There was a softness and understanding in their depths. "He's interested in me because of whom my sister is marrying." "Yes, that would be him," said the Colonel. He reached across the carriage and patted her hand. "You are wise to stay away from him." "Oh, they are racing," cried Georgiana, "and coming this direction. I think they are going to jump that hedge." There was an excitement in her voice that reminded Mary very much of Kitty. Kitty loved to be entertained. By now they had drawn close enough to see the riders. "I would wager that there is a bet that's been laid," growled Colonel Fitzwilliam. Mary sighed. "He said he would not gamble." "Wickham?" the Colonel asked in surprise. "No. If he made such a promise, I would not believe it. The other rider, Mr. Fred Hammond." She shook her head as disappointment filled her breast. "I will have a word with his brother after this. I only said I would remain silent if there was no gambling. He was to earn the money in a reputable fashion." She shook her head one more time and turned back to watch the race. Bits of earth flew in the air as both horses raced toward the hedge at the end of the field. Neither showed any sign of slowing. "Oh, good heavens!" Mary cried, as she caught sight of another rider flying down the field across the hedge. "They are going to jump that hedge, and he does not see them. She stood in the carriage. "Let me out. I must stop them. Look how quickly they are both going. Oh, he's going to die. No, 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 Nicholas!" she yelled as loudly as she could, but it was too late. One horse cleared the hedge, followed closely by the second just as Nicholas, who was attempting to turn his horse, reached that very spot. "Let me out! Please, let me out!" Tears streamed down Mary's face as she helped push open the door and jump down. "Oh, please, please do not let him be dead," she cried, as she gathered her skirts and raced across the field. The sounds of men shouting and horses screaming were drowned out by the hammering of her heart. He had to be alive. He just had to be, or her heart was surely going to die with him. Gasping for breath, she pushed her way through the crowd that had gathered around the injured men and beasts. "Fred," she said, clutching the shoulder of the man bent over the still form of Nicholas. "Fred, is he alive? Please tell me he is alive." Fred lay an ear against Nicholas's chest, pressing it first to one place and then another. "I hear his heart and his breath, and though they are not strong, he is alive." Mary sank to the ground next to Fred. "Oh, thank God, thank God!" She picked up one of Nicholas's hands and held it to her own rapidly beating heart. "We must get him home." She gave Nicholas's hand one more squeeze and then lay it back down. "Someone get the surgeon," she commanded as she stood. "You, can you ride fast?" She pointed at someone. She was not certain who it was, other than he was a soldier with a horse. "I can," he replied. "Then get the surgeon," she barked. "You," she pointed at a couple of other men. "The house is there," she pointed to Rosemore Manor. "Take him there." She turned to Fred. "Someone should stay with the horses until we can send a groom to get them." She clasped her hands in front of her stomach. "Will they need to be shot?" Her knees were beginning to tremble as the full reality of the situation crashed in on her. "Miss Mary, you should sit down." Colonel Fitzwilliam stood beside her. She shook her head. "No, no, I cannot. I will not rest until Nicholas is well." And though she meant every word of her statement, her legs were more willing to follow the Colonel's suggestion, and so Mary found herself gently lowered to the ground by the Colonel, who had managed to catch her as her knees gave way. Mary sat for a moment with her spinning head in her hands as men intertwined their arms, hoisted Nicholas off the ground, and began walking slowly across the field toward Rosemore Manor. Georgiana sat down next to Mary and wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "He is special," Georgiana whispered. Mary nodded. "Not that he knew it." Georgiana hugged her close. "He is unconscious, but he is alive. We must be thankful for that." Mary nodded again as a sob shook her body. "When you feel you can walk, we should get you to the house as well," said Colonel Fitzwilliam. Mary used the handkerchief he pressed in her hand to dry her eyes. Sitting here, crying, was not going to help anyone. So after a few deep, shaky breaths, she pushed herself slowly up from the ground. "What of Lieutenant Wickham?" she asked, attempting to search for him but having her efforts thwarted by the Colonel and several other men who had formed a wall with their bodies between her and where she suspected Wickham lay. "You do not wish to see," Colonel Fitzwilliam said. "Just know that your Nicholas was the fortunate one." Mary's legs trembled again, and were it not for the steadying arm of Colonel Fitzwilliam, she would have once again found herself on the ground. "He is dead?" The question was little more than a squeak. The Colonel nodded. "He is. Now let Georgiana and me help you to the house." Chapter 11. Mary, with cup of tea in hand, paced outside the door to Nicholas's room while the surgeon attended him. Finally, when her tea had grown cold and Georgiana had pleaded with her a dozen times to sit, the door opened and she pushed her way past Walters and into the room. "He will be well?" she asked, taking one of Nicholas's hands in her own and rubbing it to warm it. "Would not another quilt be advisable?" The surgeon shook his head. "I would not have expected you to be like your mother." Mary folded her arms and glared at the man. How dare he compare her to her mother? "If I were my mother, I would need some salts by now." The surgeon chuckled. "Thank you," Mary said to Walters, who was adding another blanket to the bed. "Will he be well?" she asked the surgeon again. "He has injured his head, so there are no guarantees." "Are there any other injuries?" "Nothing is broken. Everything moves well, but there are bumps and bruises and his ankle is swollen. He will need to stay off it for a week or two." Mr. Shepherd gave the directions and a bottle of laudanum to Walters, for pain, if you can get him to take it. He gathered his things. "Watch for fever, and send word if I am needed. If he wakes, keep him quiet and watch for signs of delusions or memory loss." He patted Mary on the shoulder. He was fortunate to have fallen without twisting. Mary stared down at the handsome man lying in the bed. He looked peaceful and not in pain. She supposed the pain would only be felt when he woke. Fred sat down on the edge of the bed, and Whit leaned against the bedpost. Mary took Nicholas's hand once again. It felt warmer. The blanket must be doing its job. "Miss," said Walters, tapping Mary on the shoulder, "your father is here to collect your sisters." "Oh, are they well?" In the commotion that had happened during and after the accident, she'd completely forgotten that they were the reason she was at the race to witness the accident. "They seem a bit shaken, but they are well." Mary nodded. "I will be down in a moment." Her eyes rested on Fred. "I wish to speak to Mr. Fred Hammond for a moment before I leave." "Very well, I will tell your father and return." Mary thanked him and then turned to Fred. "What were you thinking?" she asked quietly. She wished to yell it, but such a loud noise in a sick room would not do. "You could have killed your brother." Fred hung his head. I know that very well, Miss Mary. You promised me that you would not gamble to get the money for your curricle." Pain filled her heart and her voice. "I am so disappointed. Our agreement is void, I am afraid, but I will not tell your brother about that accident. You will tell him." "I swear, Miss Mary, I was not gambling to pay for my curricle," Fred pleaded. "But you were gambling." Mary knew it was not proper, but she sank down on the edge of the bed next to Fred. "Gambling leads to ruin." She looked at Fred and then Whit. "This is a very grave example of just that fact. Gambling ruins you and everyone around you. You race a curricle and it is damaged. Your brother feels that burden. You race across a field and nearly trample me. My ankle still feels that burden." "I know," Fred whispered. "He cares for you, you know." Mary smiled at Fred when he looked up at her in surprise. "He has not said so with his words, but when he speaks of you, I can see the concern in his eyes. If he did not care, he would let you run to ruin without a breath of opposition, and I think he does more than breathe opposition." Both Whit and Fred laughed. Fred moved his hand to rest on top of his brother's ankle. "I know it is not the thing for a man to say, but I love him." "I'm certain you do," said Mary. "I was actually gambling for him," Fred admitted. Mary's brows drew together. Surely Nicholas would not have had a part in a gambling scheme. Fred cast a look at Whit, who shrugged and nodded in response. "He thinks he does not have enough money set aside to marry. He worries over expenses. I know I am part of that, and I wish to help him. He deserves to be happy." Mary took her coat and gloves from Georgiana, who had come to remind her that they should leave. "Then make him happy by working hard and living well," said Mary, smoothing her gloves on top of her coat. "Those are not the gloves I gave you," said Fred. "I know. I did not want to have to explain why I had received a gift from a gentleman, so I will wear these old ones until I go to town. Then, in my new surroundings, no one will think to question where I got my gloves." "You are going to town?" Fred asked in surprise. "For a visit." Mary shook her head. "No, to live. First with my aunt and uncle, and then with my sister and Mr. Darcy." "But you cannot leave," said Fred. Mary shook her head again, and laying the gloves on the bed, stood and put on her coat. "I must. I would like to marry, and my prospects will be better there." "But there are gentlemen here," said Fred. "None who notice me." Mary picked up her gloves. "Who would not notice you?" asked Fred in surprise. "You are beautiful. Am I not right, Whit?" "You most certainly are, my friend," agreed Whit. Mary laughed and shook her head. "No, my sisters are beautiful. I am merely acceptable." "My brother loves you," Fred blurted. Mary halted her departure and turned back. "No, Mr. Hammond sees me as a friend and naught else. No matter how I wish it were otherwise, that is how it will always be." "You love him?" asked Fred. "It does not signify." She paused. Her heart did not wish to leave, but it was as she had said. Mr. Hammond was merely a friend. Tears stung her eyes. "He is my friend. So will you please send word if his condition changes?" Fred promised he would, and Mary, with a heavy heart, turned to leave once again. "Miss Mary," called Whit. "Yes," she answered. "When will you be leaving for town?" he asked. 2 days after Christmas." "Unless you are betrothed before then?" Mary shook her head and laughed. These two were persistent. "Yes, unless by some miracle I am betrothed before then." She turned once more before leaving the room. "Send word," she reminded them, and then she was gone. "I like her," said Fred, "and not as you're thinking. She's quite perfect for my brother." "She is," said Whit, "and how fortunate for us that she loves him." He clapped his hands softly and rubbed them together. "Well, Fred, we have just over a week to orchestrate a Christmas miracle for Miss Mary." He pulled a chair close to the bed and, dropping into it, blew out a breath. "Not beautiful? What idiot told her that?" Mary dried her eyes again and allowed herself to be helped into her gown for dinner. Georgiana and the Colonel had returned to Longbourn from Rosemore with Mary, but after a short conversation in the drawing-room, long enough to be civil but not so long as to be an imposition, Georgiana returned to Netherfield and the Colonel accompanied Darcy to Meryton to call on Colonel Forster and see what was to be done about Wickham. It was not as if the gentlemen held Mr. Wickham in any sort of esteem, Elizabeth had explained to Mary later, but they did esteem Wickham's father and Darcy's father, and knew that it would be expected that the Darcy family pay at least a small amount of respect at Wickham's death. "He certainly does not deserve it," Elizabeth added as she fastened Mary's gown. "The way he spoke of Mr. Darcy to one and all. No one would expect Mr. Darcy to lift more than a brow at the news of his death." "Then it is a wonderful demonstration of the character of both," said Mary. "Nothing could prove Mr. Wickham wrong to any greater degree than to have the man he disparaged seeing to his final accommodations." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around Mary's shoulders from behind and squeezed her tight. "Mr. Darcy said the same when Colonel Fitzwilliam suggested they owed the man nothing after all he has done." She released Mary and turned her around in a full circle. "Aside from the red of your eyes, you are quite acceptable." "You do not need to attend the dinner," said Jane. "No one would fault you for retiring to your room with a headache. You have been through quite an ordeal today." Mary shook her head. "Mamma would be displeased. She expects me to be pleasant to the Colonel." Mary's brows rose as she rolled her eyes. "You do not like Colonel Fitzwilliam?" Jane's eyes shone with mischief. "He's the son of an earl." Mary shook her head. Jane was attempting to lift her mood, and for that she was grateful. However, the suggestion that she would be an acceptable choice for someone like Colonel Fitzwilliam was not so thankfully received. She had received her mother's instructions on how to attract his attention 3 times in the past day, with the last reminder coming just before her sisters arrived to help her get ready for the evening. "As I told our mother, he is the second son of an earl, and though not the heir, I am certain he is expected to marry well. I am not an heiress, nor are my relatives gentlemen of influence. I will be cordial and all that is proper, but I will not put myself forward." She paused. "Besides, you know my heart is currently engaged elsewhere." "Did you tell Mamma that?" Shock suffused Jane's face. "Oh, not the bit about my heart," Mary explained quickly. "I would never tell Mamma anything about that." "We have one wise younger sister," said Elizabeth with a smile. "Shall we descend to the sitting-room before Mamma begins to screech for us to be quick, because the gentlemen will soon be here?" Mary laughed. "You are both very good to be attempting to lift my spirits." Jane hugged her. "I will not begin a discussion about how you deserve to be well cared for, or my eyes will be as red as yours." "Do I look very dreadful?" Mary asked, attempting to take a last look in the mirror before her sisters pulled her away. "No, not so very dreadful," said Elizabeth. "Anyone with sense will understand your appearance. Therefore, it is only our mother and younger sisters that will be of concern." And with that they left Mary's room and descended the stairs to begin a dinner party that would be less festive than Mrs. Bennet wished. Mary had been seated next to Colonel Fitzwilliam and across from Miss Darcy at dinner, and now, as the card tables were being set up, she found herself being placed in a group with him. It would not have been so torturous, for the Colonel was a great conversation partner and master storyteller, but her mother was anything but subtle about the reason for Mary being thrust upon the gentleman. "I do apologise, Colonel," Mary whispered. "My mother is desperate to see us all married, and since I am serious, and your rank indicates that you are as well." His brow flicked up in question. "'Tis my mother's philosophy," Mary explained. "I am happy to have such good company," he said, "but I dare say I would not have a chance of winning your heart even if I were at liberty to attempt it." "You're too kind, Colonel," Mary's cheeks flushed. "Oh, no," he replied with a wink. "I'm never that. Harsh and stern and blustery, but never too kind. I have a reputation to protect, Miss Mary." She laughed. "I shall keep your secret then. I am ever in your debt." He waited for her to be seated and then took the seat to her right. Several games were played and partners were shifted from one table to another. Mrs. Bennet was not known for her subtlety or sense in matchmaking, but she was a proficient at hosting soirees. It appeared to be her greatest gifting. Mary and Colonel Fitzwilliam were now seated at a table near where Kitty and Lydia were making up a set with Miss Bingley and Miss Darcy. Conversation carried from one table to the next, and Mary listened half to what was said at her own table and half to what was being said at the table next to them. Lydia was intent upon learning all she could of the latest fashions in London, and agreed wholeheartedly with Miss Bingley that, although Meryton was not completely without some sense of fashion, it was at least a season or two behind town. "I do not find things to be backward here," said Georgiana. "You have only arrived and seen little of the inhabitants." Caroline's tone was condescending. "The Bennets do things much better than others. On Sunday, when we attend church, take note of the hats. You'll not find a feather in the lot." Caroline leaned close to Lydia. "Feathers are the thing right now, you know." "I do," Lydia said with longing, "and I should have several if Papa would allow me to go to town." Caroline patted Lydia's hand. "Perhaps I can take you some time. You seem to have potential that shines beyond this small part of the world. I think you could do very well in London with a little guidance." Mary glanced over at the table in time to see Georgiana roll her eyes at the comment. There was obviously no love lost between Miss Darcy and Miss Bingley. "I do not own a single feather," said Georgiana. "I find them silly." "Silly? My dear, you have a lot to learn before you come out. Silly or not, you will have to accept the trends or be labelled a wallflower." Caroline lifted her chin. "I shall wear what I like," said Georgiana defiantly. "I would rather stand by the wall and watch others anyway." "Oh, my dear Miss Darcy, such an attitude will not do. You shall never make a good match standing near the wall." Georgiana huffed. Lydia sighed with longing. "I would love to see the soirees in town, but Papa will not pay for a season. He sees no need." "You poor girl," Caroline cooed. "I shall have to see what can be done about that as well. I'm certain taking an unschooled country miss such as yourself under my care and turning her into a sought-after dance partner would be delightfully fun and raise my worth in the eyes of many." She leaned toward Lydia again. "You must always look for ways to increase your standing. It improves the quality of the gentlemen who call on you." Mary could not refrain from rolling her eyes at the comment. Lydia, however, found the information enlightening and said as much. Did the girl not know she had just been disparaged? Mary shook her head. Such foolishness. "I heard there was a race today," Caroline said as she laid down her cards and took the game. "Are there such things in London?" Lydia asked. "Oh, there are tracks, but I've never been to a race. It is a gentleman's game, after all." "It was rather exciting until it ended abruptly," Lydia whispered. "And such a spectacle it was. Horrendous, of course, but a spectacle nonetheless." "It is not something we should discuss," said Georgiana. "A man died." Caroline patted Georgiana's hand. "A bit of news is all we are sharing," she assured. "Nothing more. These are the things that are discussed by ladies all the time when they are not with the gentlemen." Darcy, who was seated next to his cousin and across from Mary, cleared his throat. "Georgiana is correct, Miss Bingley. It is not something that she is allowed to discuss. It was a tragedy and should be treated as such. Find a different topic of conversation." The topic shifted to music and dancing at the table next to them and thankfully remained on that topic until the tea table was laid and the cards retired. Mary was thankful when the party from Netherfield departed, and she could once again retire to her room. It had been a long day, and her head hurt. She snuggled down into her bed and sent a silent prayer heavenward for Nicholas, as the tears she had fought to contain all evening were finally allowed to flow. Chapter 12. "Did you share your story like we rehearsed?" asked Whit as he and Fred drove home from church on Sunday. "I did, but I still say this plan of yours is not your best work." The two young men had shared updates on Nicholas's progress with all who asked that morning. They had also spoken about the horror of the accident and the noble way that Miss Mary had organised for the surgeon to be called and Nicholas to be tended. They had occasionally slipped in a casual reference to the fact that she'd called Nicholas by his Christian name and how she had stayed to make certain he was resting well in his room before she left. "We have very few days to arrange a marriage," said Whit. "It is not the best idea. I've granted you that already, but it is a plan. If he were not unconscious, we might be able to lock him in a room with her and force a marriage. But he is not conscious, so A bit of gossip about a possible understanding is best. He will not like it, and neither will Miss Mary. If we hurt her. He let the thought fade into his thoughts. They both knew that hurting Miss Mary would bring grave results, and not for just them. We are helping her, Whit assured Fred once again. He had had to do so many times over the course of the previous day, when they were practicing their tale, and then again this morning as they prepared for church. The conversation continued in this vein for the remainder of the trip to Rosemore. There would be a period of silence, followed by some declaration of guilt by Fred, and a reasoning away of that guilt by Whit. Jumping down from the curricle, Fred once again began to voice his concerns. It just seems there would be a better way. Whit bounded up the step and into Rosemore. We should check on his progress. He handed his coat and hat to Mr. Fraser, and with Fred close at his heels took the stairs 2 at a time. We could have just told him what we know. He can be reasonable at times. It might have worked. Whit's hand rested on the door to Nicholas's room. He would insist on having all his accounts squared away, and she would be gone before that happens. We leave at the end of this week. Who will assist him when we are gone? About that, said Fred as Whit pushed open the door. I was thinking I might not go to Bath. It might be best if I stay at Rosemore. I can write to Mother and explain what has happened. Do not write to Mother. Nick! Fred rushed across the room to his brother, who was sitting up in bed. When did he wake? He asked Walters. About an hour ago. Have you sent word to the surgeon? I dared not leave my post. He was threatening to get out of bed. I am not ill, Nicholas protested. It was a weak attempt, and he knew it. He doubted that he would be able to make it much further than the door to his room, but sitting in bed was not something he liked to do. Yes, you are ill, retorted Fred. Has Walters told you what day it is? It is Sunday. You have been unconscious for the best part of 3 days. You're not leaving your bed until the surgeon says you may. Fred folded his arms and glared at his brother. Whit and I will relieve you, Walters, so you may dispatch your messages. More than one, sir? Walters asked. Yes, a message to Longbourn to inform them that my brother has awakened and is doing well. Of course, sir. Walter bowed and left the room. Nicholas leaned his swimming head back against his pillows, resigning himself to the fact that he was not going to be allowed out of bed for a while. Why is he sending word to Longbourn? How much did Walters share with you of what happened? Asked Whit, taking up his position of leaning against the bedpost. He said I was thrown from my horse. Do you remember it happening? Nicholas groaned as he attempted to shake his head. He watched the silent conversation that passed between Whit and his brother. Was this your doing? In part, admitted Whit. We were racing and did not see you until it was too late, added Fred, pulling his chair a bit closer to the bed. I will tell you all that has happened so long as you promise not to interrupt me or raise your voice. Nicholas eyed his brother. There was something different about him. Typically, Fred would be dancing his way around whatever it was that happened in an attempt to stay out of trouble, but today he was willing to tell all. I will try. And so, Fred told his brother the full story. So, you're sending word to Longbourn because Miss Mary asked you to do so? His voice sounded surprisingly calm even to him. His brother had just confessed to partaking in a scheme that had ended in death for one man and injury for Nicholas. Fred nodded. She insisted. And you say she was here. And at the scene of the accident, added Whit. Barked out orders for your care before collapsing in tears. She was crying? For him? Why would she be crying for him? You looked like you were dead, said Fred. Oh. Nicholas let that bit of information sink into his mind. He supposed that any female would cry if she thought a person she knew had died. She called you Nicholas, said Whit, pushed her way through the crowd and held your hand until Fred had determined you were not dead. Whit took a seat on the edge of the bed. Was she there to watch Fred ride? No, she was there to gather her sisters. Miss Lydia and Miss Kitty were there to see Fred ride. Nicholas closed his eyes. He was having the devil of a time trying to piece together whatever it was that Fred and Whit were trying to tell him. There's more. Nicholas opened his eyes and looked at his brother. I promised Miss Mary I would tell you. Tell me what? His mind raced with possibilities of what Fred might have to share about Miss Mary. None of those thoughts came close to what Fred shared. She promised not to tell you about the incident because she wished for me to change my ways. Fred hung his head. She was so disappointed when she heard that we'd been racing for wages when you got hurt. She sat right there on the edge of your bed and told me that gambling leads to ruin. He shook his head. I'll never do it again. Nicholas thought back to the day he had been called on by Mr. Hallwood and the conversation he had heard in the library. So that is how you saw her hair down and noticed her curves? Fred's eyes grew wide, and he looked at Whit before nodding. You should close doors when you speak of such things. Nicholas closed his eyes again. The pain in his head was not so great as the pain in his heart as he asked, Are you determined to have her? Have you not listened? Fred asked in surprise. I have listened. She was at your side when I was injured. She inspires you to be a better man, and you find her desirable. The last word nearly caught in his throat. You are a blockhead, declared Whit, gaining Nicholas's full attention. The woman loves you, not your brother. She was weeping at your side when you were injured. She spoke to Fred about his behaviour as if he were her younger brother, and well... He paused for a moment. No, that's it. I cannot deny she's desirable. Not so lovely to look at, perhaps, as her younger sisters, but when she speaks... He shook his head. There are few who can outshine her. There was a knock at the door. I assume that is the surgeon, said Whit, rising. Marry her, Nick, said Fred, rising to follow Whit from the room. Do not wait for the money to be in your accounts. Marry her. Mr. Bennet waited for the door to open. Mr. Shepherd waited with him. Shall I examine him first, or do you wish to have your say before I do? Mr. Bennet chuckled. There will be no more injuries after my speech than before, so set about what you need to do, and I will do likewise. Of course, he cautioned, whatever you hear is, as always, to be kept in the strictest confidence. As always, Mr. Shepherd agreed as the door opened, revealing a rather shocked Fred. Do not go far, said Mr. Bennet as Whit and Fred slipped out of the room. We might have a thing or two to discuss before I leave. Fred swallowed. Yes, sir. Mr. Bennet chuckled as he closed the door and heard the lad whisper, Not your best plan, rather crossly to his friend. Nicholas shifted to sit up in his bed. Mr. Bennet, I'm surprised to see you. Is there something I can do for you? Mr. Bennet took the chair that Fred had just vacated. You know, it was not long ago that I sat in a chair next to a bed and discussed the marriage of one of my daughters. I do hope it will not become a habit. I beg your pardon. Mr. Shepherd chuckled as he tested legs and arms, watching for signs of pain. I had quite an interesting conversation with my wife after church. I still do not follow. Nicholas winced at the pain in his ankle as the surgeon moved it. It seems that my daughter Mary, as shocking as it is to me, got carried away with emotion the other day and threw herself on you while using your Christian name. He tilted his head and gave a small shrug. At least that is the tale that is being circulated. He crossed his arms and rested back in the chair. Now, I also know that when I came to collect Lydia and Kitty, Mary was here in this room with you and your brother. He held up a hand when Nicholas opened his mouth to protest. I know you were unconscious, he assured him. There is also the matter of a gift that was given to her by your brother. Something, my wife assures me, Mary would not accept if there was not some kind of understanding. Nicholas sighed. I have just recently been made aware of much of what you said. So it is true? Mr. Bennet asked. I assume it is to some extent. As you said, I have been unconscious and can only rely on what my brother and his friend have told me. Nicholas paused while the surgeon rested his ear against his chest to listen to his heartbeat. The gloves were given to replace a pair that ripped when my brother caused Miss Mary to stumble. That is what Mary claimed as well. Mr. Bennet smiled. My daughter does not often display emotion, but she has been a watering pot since Thursday last, and I suspect you are the reason. Nicholas felt his face flush. What I need to know is how to proceed with these rumours. They are small at present, and there is a chance that they can be stopped without too much damage to Mary's reputation. A lady can become overwrought at the sight of a tragedy, after all, and Mary will be leaving shortly after Christmas, so the length of time she would have to endure any sidelong looks and whispered comments would be short. However, as I'm certain you can surmise, that is not the only way in which we can deal with these rumours. The choice is yours, Mr. Hammond. You're a fine, upstanding young man. I would not be opposed to giving you Mary if you loved her. However, I would caution you not to choose that option if you do not love her, for a marriage of unequal affections is not something I would wish on either her or you. Mr. Bennet stood to leave. I trust you will attend the wedding breakfast. You do not wish to know my answer? Nicholas asked in surprise. Mr. Bennet shook his head. Not at this moment. Such a decision must not be made in haste. The wedding is on Wednesday. He paused before moving to leave. I've not always done right by my Mary, Mr. Hammond, but in this I'm determined to do better. She is a good girl and will make you or someone else a fine wife. But she deserves happiness, something she has not had much of lately." He gave a small bow. "Now, I do believe I must have a word with your brother and his friend." Nicholas nodded. "Send them to me when you're through." Mr. Bennet chuckled and left as Mr. Shepherd began to give his instructions of what was and was not allowable to Nicholas. Chapter 13. "This is much easier if you remain still," said Walters as he attempted to tie Nicholas's cravat. "One should not attend a wedding fete with his cravat all askew. It really is not the thing." "Unless you are a rake," Whit grinned from behind Fred. "The door was open," said Fred in response to his brother's glare. "It was not open," retorted Nicholas. "Open, unlocked, are they not the same?" Fred sat in the chair by the fire while Whit took a place on the window seat. "No," said Nicholas, "they are not the same." "Sir," chided Walters. Nicholas turned back to face his valet and lifted his chin slightly. "Have you come to a decision?" Whit asked. When Mr. Bennet had spoken to Whit and Fred about their part in starting the rumours circulating about Mary, Whit had ferreted out the information from Mr. Bennet that Nicholas had until today to make his intentions known. "She's pretty and can tolerate you," said Fred. He was still unhappy that he and Whit had been confined to the estate until today. Nicholas had not wished for them to have further opportunity to add to the gossip in the area regarding Mary. The last fact alone should account for a great many marks in her favour. He grinned as his brother, much to his valet's displeasure, turned and scowled. "You must admit she has also had a positive effect on me." "That is an important fact," said Walters, his lips twitching slightly. Nicholas shook his head. "And do you have any other opinions?" "Many," said Whit. "However, I believe you have heard them all over the past 2 days." "Whether I wished it or not," muttered Nicholas. He had endured speech after persuasive speech by his captives because, as they had told him when he complained, they had no one else to speak to, and nothing else of greater importance to consider. Whit had gone so far as to say that considering whether Nicholas and Miss Mary would get on well was in fact beneficial to their reformation. In the end, both Fred and Whit decided that while it was not wise to place young ladies in positions where their reputations could be ruined, neither considered that they had done any grievous harm to Nicholas. He was, they had said, cautious to the point of absurdity. Miss Mary was going to leave Hertfordshire, and there was not another lady in the whole county that would do so well as mistress of Rosemore or sister of Fred than Miss Mary. "I began drawing up some papers," said Whit. "You will wish a real solicitor to look them over, of course. But based on what I saw in your books and the information I could glean from you and Mr. Bennet, I believe that they are a good start." "You did what?" Nicholas nearly shouted, and Fred grimaced. "I told you not to tell him. I could have taken them to Mr. Phillips on the morrow after we had heard Nick's decision. He may not even choose her." "He's not a fool," said Whit. "Your brother is logical and sensible, are you not, Nick?" "Oh, he is," said Walters, who was smoothing the seams across the shoulders of Nicholas's jacket. "I doubt these seams will stay as they are once you start hopping about on that crutch, but you're presentable now." Nicholas took the crutch from where it leaned against the wall next to the mirror. He had only been given permission by the surgeon to be out of bed if he agreed to use a crutch for a week and a cane until after 12th night. It was not ideal. The crutch made it cumbersome to get around, but at least he was not confined to his room. "I know it is not my place," Walters said as he tidied things and prepared to leave, "but the consensus below stairs is in favour of Miss Mary. I only report what I hear, sir." Nicholas hobbled over to take a seat on his bed. He had stood long enough. His good ankle was beginning to ache from the exertion of supporting his full weight. "I have listened," he began, "and your arguments were sound. I was even impressed by the construction of your case. I dare say if you were to apply yourselves to your studies as you have applied yourself to convincing me of things I already knew." Here he smiled and flicked a brow at his brother, who rolled his eyes. "I believe you would do well in school and have promising careers before you." "Whit has an estate," said Fred. "He does not need a career." "Estate management is in itself a career of sorts," said Nicholas. He sighed. "But it is not merely a business venture. It should be a life. A good and happy life." He hefted himself up onto his crutch. "So, in light of that fact, I have decided you are right. Miss Mary would make an excellent wife for me." He took a hopping step toward the door. "Besides the logic of your arguments and my own opinions, I feared if I did not choose in favour of Miss Mary, I would likely find myself locked in a broom closet with her. A broom closet is much too confining and difficult to arrange, said Whit, exiting the room ahead of the others. But she likes to read and you enjoy quiet, so we had selected the library. Fred stood at his brother's side. You're not making this decision based on logic, are you? Miss Mary deserves more than that. Nicholas placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. No, he said, shaking his head. This decision, while it does make sense according to the logic you have set before me, is not a logical decision. Rosemore would profit more from a lady with a larger fortune, and waiting another year at least so that my funds could be increased would most likely be a far wiser course of action. But I would not be happy. Mary would be gone, and you are correct that there is not another like her so well suited to me, and, he smiled teasingly, I cannot stomach the idea of my hard work being left to you. Fred laughed. So you do love her? Nicholas nodded slowly. I do, and it is a fact, I believe, I would have come to realise eventually, but not in time, Fred completed the thought. Yes, Nicholas hobbled out of the room. She would have been gone before I had come to my conclusion. So, he stopped at the top of the stairs and handed his crutch to Whit as Fred wrapped an arm around him to help him descend. I do not condone your actions, any of them, he said sternly, but I will thank you for the results if she accepts me. Otherwise, you will be sent to Bath immediately. Mary stood beside her younger sisters at the church. Extra boughs of evergreen had been brought into the church and decorated with purple and white ribbons, giving the room a festive look and a pleasant woodsy fragrance. Elizabeth and Jane, who waited at the side in the back with their father, looked beautiful. Mary hoped that one day, even if she was not so happy as her sisters appeared to be, she might get her chance to stand in a fine gown and wait for a gentleman to pledge himself to her. Hope flickered briefly in her heart before she could stop it. Sunday, on his return from Rosemore, her father had told her of his discussion with Mr. Hammond, and had drawn out a confession from her regarding her feelings for that gentleman. She knew that today, if Mr. Hammond attended the wedding breakfast, she would know whether or not he returned them. For, her father had said, Mr. Hammond would not be accepted if his feelings were any less than her own. It was not right, her father had also said, for any lady so deserving of happiness as Mary was, to be married just to quell a few rumours. However, Mary had heard the whispers this morning when Mrs. Long and Lady Lucas met her mother at the church and had felt their looks of censure. Lady Lucas and Mrs. Long, as well as Aunt Phillips, would not let any rumour be quelled easily. If Mr. Hammond did not accept her... A small commotion at the door to the church interrupted Mary's thoughts. Turning, she saw a rather disgruntled Mr. Hammond entering the church with the assistance of his brother and Whit. Hope flickered once more in her heart as he smiled at her and gave a small nod of his head in greeting. He took his crutch from his brother, and then, straightening his sleeves, used the crutch to hobble to his place. She could see that his face was bruised on the right side, but aside from that and the hobbling, he looked well. She had heard he was recovering well, but not having seen him, her heart had not fully accepted the fact. However now, upon seeing him, her heart sighed in relief. "Why is he here?" asked Lydia, raising an eyebrow and looking inquisitively at Mary. To say Lydia had been a trial was to say that the ocean was a mere pond. Lydia had, at every opportunity over the past 3 days, made certain to comment in some fashion on Mary's near swooning over Mr. Hammond and the secret gift of gloves. In her version of events, the gloves were a gift secretly given by Mr. Fred Hammond on his brother's behalf. No amount of correction could change her mind. In fact, the more the truth was asserted, the more fanciful and romantic Lydia's story became. "He's a friend, I suppose," said Mary. Lydia smiled and whispered something to Kitty, which caused Kitty to cover her mouth to contain a giggle. "He's handsome, even with a few bruises." Mary pulled her head away from her mother, who had leaned close to whisper this important information in her eldest unmarried daughter's ear. If only Mrs. Bennet knew how to whisper, the comment would have been easily ignored, but sadly, Mrs. Bennet was incapable of subtlety on any level. "Smile," she hissed, with a jab of her elbow into Mary's side. "You cannot allow another chance to escape. The Lord knows you will not have an unending supply. That you have a second is miracle enough." Mary drew in a deep breath, trying to ignore her mother's criticism that went on to elaborate on how it was unlikely that any man in town would be interested in such a serious girl. "Mr. Bennet," said Whit, just as everyone took their places at the front of the church. Mary watched, curiosity suffusing her, as her father nodded and, after whispering something to Mr. Darcy that made Mr. Darcy smile broadly, left his place and went to have a whispered conversation first with Mr. Whitmore and then Mr. Hammond, who could not contain his shock, no matter how he attempted to school his features. Then at the conclusion of the discussion, Nicholas rose, and with Whit and Fred trailing behind, slowly made his way to a side room at the front of the sanctuary. "Mary," her father stood before her, "come." He took her hand and led her toward the same room where Mr. Hammond had gone. "All will be well," he assured her. Mary glanced over her shoulder as she walked. "Why is Mr. Darcy coming with us?" "Mr. Whitmore might need his assistance," replied her father with a chuckle. "I'm very confused." Surely they were not to discuss Mr. Hammond's decision now, when her sisters stood at the front of the church, and the few family and friends who had gathered awaited the ceremony. She glanced at Jane and Elizabeth. Jane was dabbing at her eyes again as she had been all morning. Tears of happiness, she had said. Elizabeth was smiling as if she understood what was happening, and she probably did since Mr. Darcy was somehow involved. "All will be made clear in a moment," her father assured her. "I had hoped we might have this completed before now, but Mr. Hammond is injured and cannot move so quickly as he normally does." He led her into the room and to a chair next to Mr. Hammond. Chapter 14. "Are you well?" Mary asked the question in a whisper to Mr. Hammond as she took her seat. His expression mirrored her own feeling of unease. He smiled and nodded. "I am well, aside from requiring a crutch to get about and a few headaches." He glanced at his brother. "Although I am not certain if the headaches are from my injury or due to the company I keep." "Likely both," Mary replied. Nicholas noted how his brother's ears reddened and his gaze dropped as Mary gave Fred a pointed look. "It appears that a good deal of conspiring has been going on while I have been recovering." "Not just while you were recovering," said Darcy with a sheepish grin. "I am very confused," said Mary. She looked around the group of men. "Shall I begin?" Mr. Bennet looked first to Darcy and then Fred and Whit. "You are her father," said Whit. "True, I am that." Mr. Bennet chuckled. "It seems that there are those among us who are as desirous to see you happy as I am, Mary. However, they are a trifle less patient." He gave her a reassuring smile. "You are well loved." Mary's brow furrowed and she looked around the group of men again. Fred, Whit, and even Mr. Darcy were nodding their agreement. The idea that these men cared about her happiness was pleasant, to be sure, but why they would insist upon sharing their sentiments now, when one of them should be getting married, was rather perplexing. Certainly this was something that could have been discussed after the wedding. Mr. Bennet caught Mary's uneasy glance toward the door to the sanctuary and sighed. "As you and Mr. Hammond both know, there are rumours which were started in an effort to force an arrangement between the two of you. There are those who are of the belief that each of you cares deeply for the other." He smiled as Mary's cheeks grew rosy. "We will not speak of that at present, as such things are best left to be declared without an audience. Suffice it to say that I believe neither of you is indifferent to the other, and since I know that Mary is anxious to be free of Longbourn, for reasons that are both understandable and a constant reproach to me, we," he waved his hand to encompass the group of men, "have contrived to purchase a special licence. Should you wish it, your sisters are not opposed to the thought of you sharing this day with them, which is why this discussion must happen now and not later." "How?" sputtered Nicholas, looking at Whit and Fred. "You were confined to the estate. I know you did not leave." Fred shrugged. "Confined perhaps, but not unable to entertain visitors." "I must take the greatest share of the blame for the licence," admitted Mr. Darcy. "When I saw how you looked at your brother when he was talking with Mary in the garden, and then learned from Elizabeth that the gentleman Mary had mentioned when we were talking on the night of Bingley's ball—" "She was not to say a word," cried Mary. "Yes, I know. She told me that too. I do hope you can come to forgive us," Darcy added. "It seemed a reasonable chance to take, and Bingley agreed that time was of the essence." "You were going to leave," explained Fred. "We could not wait. I was agreeable to it all, so long as no one forced the issue beyond the ill-conceived rumours." Here Mr. Bennet raised a brow at Whit, who attempted to look chagrined, but seemed to fall short of the emotion. "So, we will leave you to discuss what is to be done about the licence. Gentlemen," Mr. Bennet motioned to the door at the far end of the room, which led to the churchyard. In a moment the room was empty of all but Mary and Nicholas. "This is rather awkward," said Nicholas. "Very," said Mary. Her eyes watched her hands twist nervously in her lap. She could not look at him. He knew about her feelings for him, but she had yet to learn if they were returned. "I must apologize for the scheming of my brother and wit, although I am finding it a challenge to condemn them for it." Mary's head popped up and her eyes searched his. He hoped that at the end of what he had to say he would still find it difficult to condemn Fred and Wit. "I have wished to take a wife for about a year, and to that purpose I have planned. According to my timeline, marriage could be considered in 2 years' time if the estate continued to produce as it has, and with the additional field from Mr. Bingley, I hope to ensure my success if not advance my timeline. It was a well thought out and arranged plan, but it was perhaps not wise." "It sounds wise to me," said Mary. "One should not rush into marriage unprepared." Nicholas nodded. He had noted over the last year how he and Mary often agreed on the same course of action. In so many of their discussions, as they sat watching others dance, they had come to similar conclusions. He prayed that this would be another of those times. "I have come to realize recently that we do not always have the luxury of time. Had I not seen the horses coming to the hedge when I did and attempted to slow and turn my horse, I might have suffered the same fate as Mr. Wickham." Seeing the tears that gathered in her eyes, he took her hand, hopeful that he would be accepted and that she felt at least a portion for him, as he did for her. "It is not that Rosemore is not in a position to support a wife and family. It is and has been for some time." He gave her a lopsided grin. "But I was being overly cautious. No," she inserted with a shake of her head, "you must think of your father and mother, as well as Fred. There is no need to fear, their needs will be met." "But what of their extravagances?" she asked quietly. It was not polite to mention it, but she needed to know. She would not have him place himself or his family in a precarious position, no matter how much her heart wished to accept him without considering anything more than what it wanted. He blew out a breath. "I cannot say that my father will not do something to place a strain on my finances, but he could do that no matter how much I prepare." His thumb brushed back and forth across the back of the hand he held. It felt so very comforting to have her hand in his and to be able to speak to someone who understood his difficulties. This was not something he wished to risk losing. If she left, she might not return, and if she returned, it might be as a married woman. Neither option was acceptable. He'd come to realize this fact not long after he'd awakened from his fall. "After I was thrown from my horse and I was insensible to all that was around me, it was as if I was in a boat on a lake. I knew the waters were calm because the boat merely rocked gently. As I lay in this boat, I heard voices calling to me from the shore, and I attempted to sit up to see them. However, a hand, heavy as a ball of iron, held me in my place. I could only lie and listen to the calls, and for a moment I felt it too great a burden to distinguish one from the other. While I felt a longing to see who called, I also felt a desire to sleep and drift further away from the shore into a peaceful solitude." Mary's free hand covered the hand that held hers. "Oh, Nicholas," she whispered. How close had he been to being lost to her forever? He brushed a tear from her cheek. "And then I heard one voice cut through the others, clear as a bird's song on a summer day, and a warm hand held mine much as it does now. It was you, and I could not leave you then, just as I cannot bear now to have you leave me. I've considered these things since waking, and I have come to the realization that you, Mary, are more than just a friend. You are something far more dear to me. You are my heart. Say you will accept me and the license that has been secured for us. Be my mistress of Rosemore, my helper, my wife." His free hand lay on her tear-stained cheek, his thumb brushing away tears. She lifted his hand and kissed it. "Oh, Nicholas, when I saw you lying there seemingly lifeless, I felt as if my heart had been ripped from my chest. And then your brother said you lived, and my relief was so very great." She shook her head. "I cannot explain it, but I knew at that moment that my heart would never belong to another. My poor father and sisters have watched me cry so many times these past few days, but not because I worried for your health. Though I did. I wept at the thought of leaving Hertfordshire and you. I would be pleased." Mary smiled through her tears. "No, I would be delighted to marry you." The door at the end of the room cracked open just as Nicholas stood to draw Mary into his embrace. "Are you finished? We're getting cold." Wit's head poked through the small opening. "Then I suggest you find the main entrance to the church and use it," said Nicholas. "But what is your answer?" Though Whit's head still poked into the room, he was obviously struggling against someone who was trying to pull him back. "I have not prepared to leave Longbourn," said Mary. "We've seen to that." Whit slapped his hand in the direction of whoever was attempting to extract him from the room. "Fraser also knows to expect Miss Mary. Not a thing has been left undone." He finally lost his struggle, and the door slammed shut for a moment before reopening. "He is persistent," muttered Nicholas. "What shall I tell him, my love?" "Wedding papers?" Mary asked, peeking her head around Nicholas's arm. "All set, but can be amended in a moment's time. Your uncle is willing to do whatever is necessary, and his clerk's replacement is not so bad a fellow. Relatively bright." Mary laughed. "Then find the entrance to the church, inform my sisters and the parson of the change, and have my father come escort me from this room." But he had turned to leave, and she waited until she had his attention once again. "Not for about 3 minutes. Now go away." "Right away, Miss Mary." The door clicked close, and Nicholas did not waste a moment in claiming her mouth with his. Later, when a soft rapping came at the door, he leaned his forehead against hers. "I have never done anything this impetuous." "Nor have I," she replied. "I am a cautious creature, you know." "As am I. But we should not be cautious to a fault, would you agree?" "I would indeed." She lifted onto her toes and placed one last kiss on his lips as the door opened. "You know, a fortnight ago I had thought this would be a very bittersweet Christmas. And what do you think now? It is but a week away." He accepted his crutch from Mr. Bennet and released Mary to take her father's arm. She bit her lip as if to keep her smile from spreading too widely, and her eyes shone with delight. "Now! It shall be the most joyous ever." "I do hope that there will be others that will outshine it," said her father, "but it does me good to hear you say such. Come along, your mother is beside herself with nerves at the delay. Shall we surprise her with this announcement?" There was a twinkle in his eye. Mary nodded, and with a last look over her shoulder at Nicholas, left the room on her father's arm. Nicholas allowed Whit to straighten his cravat and jacket, and did not even growl at any of the rather inappropriate congratulations Whit and Fred gave him. In fact, he had to agree with at least one, though he would not say it aloud. This would be one very Merry Christmas. Chapter 15, Epilogue. Christmas Day 1 year later. Mary slipped her arm through Nicholas's as they stood at Rosemoor's door, watching Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's carriage make its way down the driveway as soft snowflakes began to fall. "You have made my mother and sisters very happy. My father might not forgive you, however. Nor will Fred and Whit, I imagine." He smiled broadly at the thought. Although Fred and Whit had not contrived to endanger either life, limb, or education, they had managed to aggravate Nicholas on more than one occasion over the last year. If their refusal to travel to Bath and resolute insistence upon tiptoeing around Rosemoor being conspicuously inconspicuous, coupled with their suggestions about early bedtimes last Christmas, had not been enough. Fred had written several times after returning to school with suggestions about which room would make the best nursery and what names he preferred for a niece or nephew. Nicholas had expected the matter to be silenced once he had written to tell Fred that an addition to the family was expected to arrive near Michaelmas. However, that news had only made matters worse. For then, whenever there was any break in classes, Fred would find his way to Rosemoor and insist that Nicholas was not caring well enough for his wife. "What do you mean she can carry that tray?" his brother would scold. "She might trip. A walk? To where? Are you certain that it is allowable?" he would question. It was as if his brother, who was not yet 25, had turned into a nattering old woman. He chuckled. It was not unlike Mrs. Bennet. "It will be a quiet few months, however," Mary said with a smile. Her mother had made her presence known both at Rosemoor and Netherfield on a nearly daily basis. There were instructions on how to best arrange furniture and handle accounts, as well as ill-disguised hints about hosting parties and dinners. And then, when she'd learned she was to have a grandchild, Mary shook her head. She would be thankful for even a week of peace. "No," Nicholas countered. "We shall still have Uncle Fred when he is not absolutely confined to school." Mary leaned into Nicholas's side. "You do know he has spoken to my uncle regarding a position, do you not?" Nicholas groaned. His brother was thinking of moving to the area? "No, he has not mentioned it." What of his time in Bath with my father before taking up his profession? Mary squeezed his arm. He has reconsidered much after your accident, and there may be a particular young lady that has caught his eye. However, I'm not to mention it. You're keeping secrets from your husband? Nicholas clucked his tongue. Did you notice how he stood up with someone at least twice at the last party at Lucas Lodge? She hinted. Nicholas stopped outside the drawing room where the rest of their guests were still gathered. I thought that was to avoid your youngest sister. Mary giggled. In part. Lydia had attempted to attract Fred's attention when it became apparent that Whit had taken a decided liking to Kitty, but she had met with little success. Fred had sworn off his impetuous ways and found that a quieter, more serene lifestyle suited him right well. That is, it did most of the time. There were limits to how serious a young man could be. However, being able to return to a peaceful home was his desire, for he had seen such at Rosemore. Miss Maria is a good choice, commented Nicholas. Fred is capable of making them, you know, Mary said. Thanks in no small part to your influence. He bent and kissed her. Mary had been the steadying hand that Fred had needed, and the soothing balm he himself had needed after dealing with his brother. With a wink and a second kiss, he led her into the drawing room, and they took their places. Where is Whit? Nicholas asked. Uncle Whit. Darcy's lips pursed in amusement at the moniker that Whit had insisted must be his, has taken it upon himself to see that his niece and 2 nephews are well cared for. I dread to think of what he might be teaching them, said Nicholas with a shake of his head. They are young, said Elizabeth, far too young to remember what he says. I think your daughter is safe. She'd better be, muttered Fred before turning to Nicholas. What possessed you to give my place in London to the Bennets for the season? Truly? Bingley asked in surprise. You do not know why? Fred shook his head. Bingley laughed. We wished for a few months of quiet, and with Mrs. Bennet ensconced in London we shall have it. Darcy chuckled. He may always take an estate closer to Derbyshire. We have not discounted the idea, Bingley replied, but until I can be free of Caroline it is more convenient to be near London. Thankfully, Mr. Hurst had offered to keep Caroline in town. She was more content to be there than in the country, and her prospects of marriage were greater there as well. Bingley had found little pleasure in attending soirees after he had married. He could not dance with his wife nearly so much as he wished, and disliked watching others sweep her about the dance floor. Fortunately, he'd been able to use the arrival of his son just a month ago as a reason to sit this season out and remain at Netherfield. Although, I have found Hammond to be an excellent guide in learning the business of an estate and may decide to stay even after Caroline is married. Whit is not just looking in on the children, said Fred, inserting himself into the conversation. You have sent Miss Kitty off to be snapped up by some gentleman that is not him, and he needed a moment. He's serious about Kitty? Asked Mary. Fred nodded. I knew he found her interesting, continued Mary, but he seemed to flit and flutter with no specific design. Why did you not tell me? Has he spoken to her father? Asked Darcy. Fred chuckled. No, but her father has spoken to him. And what were the results of that conversation? Nicholas remembered well having Mr. Bennet come to speak with him days before he and Mary married. Whit has written to his father, said Fred. The estate is not yet his, you know, but there are a small cottage and a bit of land that could be his if he wished. What else do you know of his situation? Asked Darcy, cocking his head and grinning at Nicholas. Fred looked between his brother and Darcy, a smile spreading across his face. I know that he is financially sound, and I can find out what I do not already know if you can get Mr. Bennet to write up his portion for Miss Kitty. Will she accept him? Asked Mary. And then her eyes narrowed as another thought struck her. Is this how you conspired to have Nicholas and me marry so quickly? I shall do my part this time, as I did then, by obtaining the licence, said Darcy with a sheepish grin. The rest of the plan was Whit's. The question still remains if she will accept him, said Jane. I should not like to see him hurt. He is a sweet man. Does she like him well enough? Darcy asked Elizabeth. From what I've seen, I believe she does, Elizabeth replied. But I shall ask her when we call at Longbourn tomorrow. You're planning a 12th night soiree, are you not, Bingley? Nicholas asked. I am. Nicholas smiled and raised an eyebrow at his brother. Broom closet or library? He asked. However, as events unfolded, it was neither the broom closet nor the library, but the hall outside the nursery at Netherfield, where the schemer, who had done so much which had led haphazardly to happiness for Mary, was himself caught in a scheme, and as 12th night ended, he became uncle, not just in name, but in fact, to the many children that would over the years fill the nurseries at Netherfield, Pemberley and Rosemore. This has been A Very Merry Christmas, a dash of Darcy and Companions collection, Book 3, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorised voice replica. The 2016 copyright for A Very Merry Christmas is held by Leanie Brown. All rights reserved.